Hi everyone, I am Dream Into Wealth. I know people watching this are trying to fall asleep. How are you? And I hope you are okay in life. Listen to my story and make yourself comfortable. Also, if y'all like this kind of stories, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Rain had been falling since noon, the kind of slow gray pour that soaks through a man's hat and patience at the same time. Out on the edge of Barrel Creek, the windmills squeaked lazy circles above the McAllen Ranch, and down beneath its shadow sat an old man with a notebook and a cup of black coffee gone cold. Folks called him Silas McAllen, the richest man in 3 counties, though most wouldn't have guessed it from the worn coat and the scuffed boots. He wasn't born rich, and he didn't strike it lucky. He'd tell you that straight squinting through the drizzle. He ain't about luck, he'd mutter, thumbing through that notebook. It's about counting what don't shine. Barrel Creek hadn't always had much to count. Back when Silas was a boy, it was little more than dust, barbed wire, and too-made dreams that died of thirst. His pa ran cattle until the droughts took him, then fenced wind just to feel useful. Silas learned young that hope don't feed you unless you feed it first. He'd mend fences for pennies, patch boots for nickels, save every coin he could scrape together. Not much to it, but each penny was a seed. The trouble was, most men in Barrel Creek didn't believe in seeds. They believed in strikes. Silver, gold, oil, didn't matter what, long in it glittered. They'd blow every dollar on rumors of fortune, leave their wives with empty shelves and their hearts full of dust. But Silas watched and waited, and when others ran after shine, he learned to see value where no one else looked. One night when the rain came down, much like it did now, he made his first real mark. He was 22, running a failing mule team hauling scrap metal out to the mines. The miners were broke, the company was worse, and he'd nearly sold his team for feed money. But then he noticed something the others didn't. The scrap itself, bent rails, broken gears, old pumps trashed to most, but steel was steel. He sold half, melted the rest down, and made tools to lease back to the very miners who'd thrown it away. By the time the dry season hit, Silas had more than feed money. He had purpose. He kept a ledger in his pocket, not of debts but of lessons, each page a reckoning. What worked, what failed, what nearly ruined him. That ledger grew heavy with ink in time, until every decision was weighed not by hope but by history. A man who don't learn his own arithmetic, he'd say, ain't fit to count another man's money. Barrel Creek started changing, the mines closed, but a new railroad cut through the canyon. Land once worth pennies a mile was suddenly gold by the acre. While others cursed the noise, Silas listened to opportunity whistle. He bought parcels nobody wanted, the rocky kind where nothing grew but sage, and waited.
I get corridor de retail store, water stations, and lumber yards. He sold just enough to build the McAllen supply code, then leased the rest to travelers. That was when folks started calling him the quiet banker. Not because he ran a bank, but because he was one. Every handshake was a contract, every favor a future interest. When storms ruined a neighbor crop, Silas let seed, not coin. When debts came due, he took work, not land. Land sacred, he'd say, coin temporary. But a man word that a currency can't be printed. Through those years, Silas built not just a business, but a philosophy. He called it slow gold to him. Wealth was like water. It moved, but only if you guided it with care. He'd sit by the fire with a whiskey glass and that notebook open, mumbling figures to himself. Slow gold, he'd whisper. Runs quiet, runs deep. It was around that time the drifters started showing up. Men broke by their own gambling hands, widows with deeds too heavy to hold, young bucks with more pride than tan. And Silas,
he helped them. Not out of charity, but out of principle. Your man trying, I'll lend him a shovel, he'd say. If he's sleeping, I'll let the rain wake him. Barrel Creek grew rich around him, though nobody quite nut when it happened.
The saloon turned into a merchant house, the feed store into a telegraph post, and Silas' small shed became an office full of ledgers and lanterns. He hired men who'd once worked for him as laborers, made them partners in the work they'd built. Some folks said he was soft, others said he was cunning, but all agreed on one thing: Silas McAllen never missed a A-tail. And when the panic of 9/3 rolled through, tearing banks apart like rotten fences, Barrel Creek held firm. Silas' men had savings, his ranches had stores, and his word carried more weight than coin. While cities fell into ruin, the quiet banker light burned steady on the plains. That rainy afternoon, decades later, Silas sat by his window again, flipping through the old ledger with a shaky hand. pages yellowed, corners torn, but every lie still sharp. He wasn't counting wealth anymore. He was counting time. Outside, the thunder rolled slow and distant, like an old memory returning home. He smiled faintly and muttered, "Slow gold still runs, don't it?" The rain didn't let up that night. It sang steady on the tin roof, a lullaby for the patient and a warning for the restless. Silas sat with his ledger open, thumb tracing the inked lines that had carried him farther than luck could. The words weren't numbers alone. They were stories, every profit with a scar behind it, every loss with a lesson worth keeping. I could remember each one clear the ridge kind at sunrise, like the time he trusted a man named Caleb Boone, smooth talker with a handshake that felt solid dyed oak but hollow as smoke. Caleb had pitched him a grand idea. Barley by the acre, feed for the railroad workers, profit by the ton, sounded fine enough to stir greed even in cautious hearts. Silas invested modestly, cautious as always, and waited. The barley grew tall, but Caleb's promises grew taller. His borrowed against Silas' name spent more than he planted and skipped town with the season end. It nearly broke him. For the first time, Silas stared at an empty barn and felt the cold sting of foolish trust. But rather than curse the man, he wrote a new line in the ledger. At night, never loan a man money when what he needs is discipline. From then on, his lending changed. He stopped financing dreams. He started funding grit. If a man wanted help, he had to sweat for it. Work first, profit later. The town called it harsh. Silas called it honest. The years pressed on, and so did he. By the turn of the century, Barrow Creek had grown fat with rail traffic and mining money. Outsiders came sniffing around like wolves, bankers, speculators, city men in fine hats with softer hands. They wanted to buy Silas land for expansion, promising more gold than any man could count. They meant trouble. Had to sweat for it. Work first, profit later. The town called it harsh. Silas called it honest. The years pressed on, and so did he. By the turn of the century, Barrow Creek had grown fat with rail traffic and mining money. Outsiders came sniffing around like wolves, bankers, speculators, city men in fine hats with softer hands. They wanted to buy Silas land for expansion, promising more gold than any man could count. Listened, nodded, polite, but inside he measured their words by a cal. No coin could tip gentlemen, he said, drawl, slow and patient. I am poor and I am cautious. Both teach a man not to sell his roots, 'cause the wind blowing hard. They left angry, and within 5 years, most of their investments were dust. The railroad shifted routes, and Barrow Creek boom cooled to a quiet hum. But Silas, he'd already moved his chips. He'd taken the profits from land sales and poured them into grain storage, dry goods, and cattle co-ops. Where others saw endings, he saw beginnings disguised in patience. It was whiles then that his nephew, young Henry McAllen, came riding in from Amarillo. Henry was all the things Silas used to be. Sharp eyes, quick temper, restless with the weight of ambition. He wanted to turn the family quiet business into an empire. "Uncle," he said, leaning across the desk, "we're sitting on fortune. Why crawl when we can fly?" Silas chuckled, pouring coffee that smelled more like tar than comfort. "'Cause boy, flight for birds, and birds don't leave roots behind worth a damn." Henry didn't listen. He took a loan, opened a new trade route, and within 2 years had tripled dead the company value. For a while, it seemed he'd proven the old man wrong. But greed don't ride solo, it brings its friends. When drought hit and prices fell, Henry Fortune blew away like dry hay. Came back hollow-eyed, pockets empty, pride shattered. Silas didn't scold him, just slid the ledger across the table and tapped one old line. "Slow gold runs quiet, runs deep." Henry read it and cried right there by the fire. "How do you keep believing, Uncle?" he asked. Silas leaned back, eyes heavy with years. "Belovin's fun. Belief for when you don't know. I know what patience does. I've seen it work. Storms don't scare a man who planted before they came." That night Henry stayed, learned the trade the hard way, inventory by lantern light, balance sheets scratched by hand, deals made with calloused palms instead of silver tongues. Slowly under Silas' watch he rebuilt. But though the profits were small, they were steady. As seasons turned, the McAllen Supply Co. became more than a business. It became the town backbone. Silas built a system where no family went hungry, where every debt had a path to forgiveness but not escape. He didn't want to own Barrel Creek. He wanted it to own itself. A rich town, he'd say, is made of money. It's made of memory that don't forget fairness. In his later years, folks would come from far-off counties just to ask his advice. He'd sit by the stove, ledger open, draw slow. Don't buy what shines fast. Don't spend what ain't worked for you.
Dann tanzte Jeffrey Boyne, wording with Idriat Vito, Domwell Van Cor. And they always did. His barn stayed full, his men stayed fed, and his conscience stayed quiet. And in those long-range slicket nights when thunder rolled and the world felt smaller than his porch light, he'd whisper to himself with prayer. Slow gold still runs. The years rolled on like slow thunder over the plains. Time had a way of sanding the sharp edges off a man, and by the time Silas McAllen was gay from crown to chin, there was not much left in him that moved quick. The world beyond Barrel Creek had grown louder automobiles snorting down dirt roads, telegram line budded with news from cities that had never smelled rain on dust. But Barrel Creek stayed slow, and Silas stayed slower still, keeping his pen scratching and his eyes on the numbers that mattered. Henry had grown into his boots by then, shoulders broader, hands steadier, mind tempered by the droughts that had taught him what no ledger had blood.
Under Silas' patient watch, the young man had rebuilt the trade routes, this time cautious, mapping every mile, storing grain against the long seasons. You can't make the sky rain, boy, Silas told him one evening, voice crackling like the fire, but you can make sure the barrels don't leak when it finally does. The McAllen name had become something solid in those parts, a promise more than a brand.
When folks spoke it, they meant fairness, not fortune, yes? And yet, in quiet corners of the saloon, the younger men began whispering that old Silas was too slow for the new century. They said a man could make a lifetime set in a seen stock trade, that fortunes now rode on rails and wires, not wagons and patience. Henry heard those words too, and they stirred something restless inside him that he thought he'd buried. It came to a head one autumn when a group of city investors rode into Barrel Creek with papers slicker than snakeskin. They offered Henry a partnership to expand the McAllen Co. into a regional freight service, modern warehouses, telegraph offices, engines that could move goods 100 times faster than a mule team it could. All we need, the lead investor said, smiling wide, is a man with lid, reputation, and grit. Henry had all three. The only hitch was Silas. That night, rain was drumming on the porch roof when Henry came to the old man cabin. The smell of coffee and smoke filled the air, and the ledger sat open as it always did, pages yellow as prairie straw. Uncle Henry began. They're offering me a chance to change everything, to make this town more than a stopover. Silas didn't look up. He just kept writing. And what will you pay for that chance? They'll buy in, build infrastructure, will own shares. They'll double what this town earns in 5 years. Silas closed the book, a soft clap of paper like a judge gavel, and about doubling. It about keeping. You could double if they too fast. Boy, you forget what it's worth. Henry's voice rose with the storm. You built this place from nothing. You taught to see value. The others don't. But times are changing. You can't hold back progress with a pencil and a promise. The old man gaze was steady, slow. Hey, and look you. Crack at the happy line hand was open. So it helped a little bit of cutter what Saddleback had in the contract. For a while the deals went fine. Money poured in like spring floodwater. The freight line rose, rails gleaming in the morning light, wagons replaced by engines that screamed across the land. Barrel Creek prospered. At first, then came the panic of 1907. Banks froze, loans vanished, and the investors who'd shaken Henry's hand disappeared into telegram silence. The engines stopped, the warehouses emptied, and Henry stood in the echo, broke again, but this time with the whole town staring to him. He rode back to the ranch, hat low, clothes soaked with shame. Silas was on the porch, ledger closed beside him, no anger in his face, just that same patient sadness that time teaches the wise. You were right, Henry said, voice barely a whisper. Silas nodded. Ain't about being right. That's the mountain figure that span into that get it over, we dollar cold. Crack rolling. People at moments. I'm like, I want to cut a bunch of houses told him. The same thing he always said.
Slow gold runs quiet. Together, they drafted plans to pay off debt, rebuild trust, start again. Not big, not fast, but honest. The next morning, the old man took out a new notebook, blank and waiting. "Ledger yours now," he said, pushing it across the page. "But don't fill it with numbers, fill it with reasons." Henry stared down at it, then up at his uncle. "You're not quitting, are you?" Silas smiled faintly. "I ain't quitting slow for 10 years. Don't rush an old man, exit." That winter was the last Silas saw. He went quiet in his sleep during a gentle rain, his hat hanging by the door, his ledger closed beside the lamp. The town buried him on the ridge overlooking Barrow Creek, windmill creaking above the grass, sky gay with drizzle. Henry spoke few words, only the ones his uncle had lived by. Slow gold runs quiet, runs deep. Years later, when telephones hummed and cars rolled through the valley, people still spoke of Silas McAllen. Not as a banker or a tycoon, but a man who'd made patience a kind of wealth that no market could break. His story passed down through generations, whispered by lantern light or in the hum of rain. Some called it luck, others called it wisdom.
But the old-timers, the ones who remembered his steady drawl of a ledger that never lied, they paid it truth. The McAllen ranch kept breathing after Silas passed, though the rhythm of it changed. Henry was the one folks came to now, and though he wore a sharper hat and cleaner coat, he carried the same weight that had once lived behind his uncle's steady eyes. He didn't talk much about progress anymore. The shine of easy money had burned out of him during those lean years. What he kept from Silas was the slow pulse of work, the feel of a ledger under his hand, the sound of coins counted one at a time, the way the air settled when a deal was done fair. Barrow Creek itself had grown slicker on the edges. A bank stood where the old supply store had been, its sign painted with letters proud enough to make the sky look smaller. Trains came regular now, bringing new faces and restless dreams. The townsfolk were proud of their prosperity, but pride has a way of talking louder than sense. Young men boasted about shares and speculation, about a future made of paper rather than sweat. Henry listened, smiled polite, and kept his feet planted where the soil still remembered Silas' boots. Every so often, though, he felt the tug. There were days when the telegraph lines hummed with talk of fortunes won overnight. Oil strikes in Oklahoma, gold dawns in Alaska, stocks climbing like sunrise. He'd stare out the window at the fields and think maybe he was turning into a relic. But then he'd open the old ledger and read the neat rows of handwriting, the faded ink that told him storms always come and patience always outlasts. The temptation would fade. Slow gold, he'd murmur, running a thumb over the brittle paper, still runs deep. It was about that time the bank started pressing him for expansion. A man named Charles Pennington rode in from Dallas wearing a city suit and a smile with two made teeth. "Mr. McAllen," he said, shaking Henry's hand like a salesman sealing fate, "you've got the respect of this whole region. You could turn that reputation into an empire, loans, credit lines, investments. We could modernize Barrow Creek together." Henry asked for a week to think. When Pennington left, he took the long walk up to the ridge where Silas lay. The grass was high, the wind soft, the world slow. He sat beside the headstone till dusk, ledger open on his knees. The answer was right there in the silence. When he came down, he wired Pennington one line: "Not interested. We already have all the gold we can pen. Word spread quick. Gossip always does." Some said Henry had lost his nerve. Others said he was guarding his uncle's ghost. But he didn't much care for either. He just kept working, fixing roofs after storms, buying grain when prices dipped, selling when it rose. Simple math, steady heart. Then came 1929, the year the cities cracked. Barrow Creek heard the crash through telegrams and frightened travelers. Banks folded, the wet paper, farms dried, wages shrank to whispers. But the McAllen store stayed open. Henry had kept reserves of grain, oil, and cash enough to hold through drought. He loaned fair and collect slow, asking only for work in return. The town people remembered that. They helped one another because he helped them first. By winter, wagons from neighboring counties rolled into Barrow Creek, seeking food and trade. The McAllen barns were full. and Henry opened them without ceremony. "We'll get through it together," he told anyone who came to his door. "This here's Silas Grain, and he wouldn't want it rotten when good folks are hungry." Years passed like that, one lean season after another, until the world steadied again. When prosperity returned, Barrow Creek was the only town in 3 states that hadn't lost its heart. The bank reopened under new management, but folks still preferred the old store, the place where patience still meant something. By then, Henry Hare had gone silver. He took to sitting on the porch at sundown, ledger balanced on his knees, children dead around asking questions about the old days. He'd tell them stories, not about money, but about men, about his Uncle Silas who could see profit in a broken axle, about neighbors who shared seed in droughts, about how greed and storms looked different but acted the same. Gold, he'd say, ain't metal, it's memory you can trust. Sometimes he'd close his eyes and hear the faint creak of the windmill on the ridge, the sound of a rain that had started long before he was born and would go on long after. The world had changed around him, radio crackling from windows, cars kicking dust down the roads, but the rhythm beneath it hadn't. Work honest, spend careful, keep your word. The rest was noise. When Henry passed on, they found the 2 ledgers side by side in the drawer. Silas worn one in his own, bound in new leather. Inside the front cover of Henry's book was a single line written in his Uncle Old hand. Slow gold runs quiet, runs deep, and beneath it in Henry handwriting, and it never runs out if you share it right. The McAllen name faded in time, swallowed by modern sprawl, but the town that grew where Barrow Creek once stood still bore trace of that creed. A man's shop window had a sign that read, "Fair Trade Only." The Market Ledger had a margin note that said, "Don't count faster than you can bless." Those they didn't know whose words they were copying. They knew they worked. The town changed again. Big towns always do. Asphalt came where the dirt roads once lay, and the windmill that had grown through 3 generations was finally taken down and sold for scrap. They built a water tower in its place, painted it bright white, stamped with the words Barrow Creek Cooperative. Folks said it was progress, but on quiet nights when the air cooled and the horizon burned red, you could still almost hear the old windmill squeak, patient as is. By then, the McAllen name had faded from storefronts and grain silos, but not from hearts. Henry's son, Walter, had moved east to study finance in the city. He came back with polished shoes and ideas that rattled like silver dollars in a tin cup. He said, standing in the doorway of the store, "The world moving faster now. Markets don't wait. Credit ain't sin anymore. It's a tool." Henry had only smiled, tired eyes soft in the lamplight. "Tools are fine, boy, so long as you don't forget which end cuts." Walter stayed a few years, building ledgers thicker than his father. He taught the co-op to track loans, manage grain futures, even trade small portions of their stock in city exchanges. The town prospered again, new tractors, new schools, new hope. But prosperity is a sly friend. Smile while it loose your belt. When the Second War came, the young men left, and the fields went quiet. Walter managed the shortages the best he could, writing ration plans in his far-old notebook, using the margins to sketch charts and formulas that would have baffled Silas himself. But the principle stayed. Share in storm. The book still read, "Patience outlasts hunger," and so they endured. They always did. After the war, Walter found himself drawn toward the very thing his father had warned against: speed. The world was roaring, and he wanted Barrow Creek to roar with it. He opened a branch office in Dallas, started handling investments for neighboring counties. For a time, he was right. The town grew richer. The co-op became a full-fledged bank, and people hailed him a visionary. Yet the faster the current ran, the more folks forgot what it meant to wade. It started small. Loans stretched thinner. Farmers borrowed against harvests they hadn't planted yet. The balance between need and want began to blur. Walter told himself it was fine. It was growth. He'd look at his grandfather's old ledger sometimes, just to feel grounded. But the ink there seemed quieter than it used to, the pages heavier. Then came the drought of 5-6. Crops withered, cattle died, and folks who'd bet their future on tomorrow rain found themselves staring at cracked earth. The co-op nearly folded. Walter spent sleepless nights rewriting notes, begging creditors for extensions, selling off his own holdings to keep the bank afloat. When it was done, Barrel Creek had survived, but barely. And Walter had learned what every McAllen learned sooner or later: fast gold runs hot, burns quick, and leaves you cold. He closed the Dallas branch, sold the big car, moved back to the family house. Every morning he'd sit on the porch with the same view Silas once had: the ridge, the grass, the slow wind crawling over it. He kept a single-page pen above his desk. Slow gold runs quiet, runs deep. Below it, in his own shaky hand, he'd added, fast gold burns loud, burns brief. The years softened him. He taught the local school children how to read ledgers, not for business, but for understanding. He'd say, a book like this ain't just for money. It's for keeping track of your mistakes. That's the only balance that matters. The children didn't always listen, but their parents did. They began keeping notebooks of their own gardening records, weather notes, even little journals about gratitude and loss. The town changed again, but in quiet ways that mattered. When Walter passed, they buried him beside Henry and Silas on the ridge, the three names carved in a line, 3 generations of patience standing guard over the valley. And though the new world beyond the hills buzzed with television light and the hum of machines, Barrel Creek stayed calm. The co-op became a credit union, the ledger a computer file, but the creed still whispered through the wires. Folks would still say it when the sky darkened and storms veered over the plains: slow gold runs quiet. The phrase had outlived the men who spoke it first, become much a prayer, aid advice. The older ones still believed it was true. The younger ones weren't sure, but liked out it sounded in the rain. And sometimes when lightning cracked and thunder rolled across the ridge, they could almost hear Silas laughing softly, voice wrapped in wind. Patience, boys. Patience always pays. By the time the century turned again, Barrel Creek was just a dot on a digital map, no longer a town so much as memory stitched into a county line. The co-op still stood, its old brick painted fresh every decade by volunteers who didn't quite know why they cared so much about a building that sold little and earned less. The grain silos were empty now, replaced by concrete shells that echoed when the wind came through, sounding for all the world like a man humming to himself while he worked. There was still one McAllen left to mind the place, Ruth, Walter, granddaughter. She wasn't much for ranching or ledgers. She'd studied accounting in Austin, learned computers, learned that money moved faster than thought now. But when her father died, she came home to set his estate and never quite left. In Bearwatt may expanding as any atlas glowed on the subtly awesome but the tyree-cations. Very awesome. It's one of the favorite. What a cup of soup, boys. She said later that the quiet got inside her bones. The city noise is a promise, she told a friend, but the quiet out reminds you what you already have. Ruth turned the co-op into something new. She put up solar panels where the feed lot used to be, ran broadband cables through the Zane paths. Sealess mules once hauled rails. She didn't call it a bank or a business. She called it the Barrel Fund. It wasn't built for profit but for survival. People from nearby towns could borrow small sums interest-free, pay back when they could, help another when they did. The money moved like rainwater through dry gullies, slow, clean, patient. She said it was the only way to make capital honest to give. Most folks thought she was crazy at first. Chard don't last, they told her. You'll run dry by harvest. But the thing about patience is it looks foolish right up until it isn't. Within 5 years, the fund had tripled dead. Not because of greed, but because people didn't take more than they needed. It wasn't a miracle, it was math written in mercy. Ruth kept the old ledgers on a shelf above her desk, still yellowed, still smelling faintly of smoke. She said she could feel the weight of them at times he made alone. Slow gold runs quiet, she'd whisper, pressing the enter key like her great-grandfather once pressed int into paper. Tourists started sewed up, curious about the cowgirl banker who ran a town with no mortgages and no foreclosures. Journalists came too, pens twitching for the secret to her success. She always gave the same answer. There ain't no secret, it's a trust with a calculator. Sub laughed, but they wrote about her anyway. Articles called her the modern McAllen, the last banker of the plains, the woman who outweighted Wall Street. She didn't care much for titles. She cared for mornings when the valley smelled of wet sage and the solar panels caught the first light glittering like a new kind of gold. But even patience meets its test. The storm came not from the sky, but from the screen. A globe crashed, numbers tumbling faster than any storm wind. Overnight, markets sank, currencies twisted, and every expert on television said the same thing. Hold nothing, sell everything. Ruth sat in the co-op office while the rain hammered the roof. That's that it had in Silas' time. She opened her computer, checked the accounts, and saw that her fund was still whole. No leverage, no speculation, just people owing and repaying one another. Slow gold, unchanged by panic. She poured coffee, smiled faintly, and whispered to the storm, "You'll pass too." When it did, the papers called her a genius. She said she was careful, but deep down she knew she was never alone in that quiet. Every time the wind leaned against the tower, it sounded like the turning of a page. Sometimes at dusk, when the rain smelled like dust again, she swore she could feel a hand on her shoulder, old, calloused, patient, reminding her to write the next line. Years later, when Ruth retired, she didn't sell the fund. She handed it to a group of students from the local college, kids who'd come to study economics but stayed for the silence. She told them, "Don't grow it fast, grow it fair." They promised they would. When she drove out of Barrel Creek for the last time, she looked back at the ridge where 3 stones stood in a row. The grass waved, the sky glowed copper, and for a moment she thought she saw 3 figures by the old windmill, hats low, watching her go. That night it rained, steady and slow. Somewhere in the dark, a generator hummed, a battery charged, a balance sheet dead itself quietly on a screen. The numbers glowed like lantern light. Silas Creed had found another century to live in, and the land patient of its end. Listen, the Barrel Fund outlived its founders the way the plains outlived the wind. Years turned like wagon wheels, and faces changed behind the same wooden doors. The ledgers became data on servers, and the buildings sprouted antennas instead of weather vanes. Yet the rules inside those digital books were still the same, simple, human, steady. Don't take what you can't return. Don't promise what you don't mean. And always leave enough for the next storm. By the middle of the century, Barrel Creek itself had vanished beneath progress. The highway cut straight through the old valley, and folks speeding by could barely see the ridge or the faded lettering on the co-op brick wall. But the fund had grown into something quiet and wide its reach, stretching into towns, then states, then entire networks of people who traded help instead of interest. They didn't even know the story name anymore. They that taught it the slow system. One of those people was a man named Eli Navarro. He wasn't a banker or rancher. He was a truck driver who'd spent his life moving freight along the same highway that carved through Barrel Creek. When the company he worked for folded in an economic slump, he found himself stranded in a rest stop out the old town, out of gas, out of savings, and nearly out of faith. He found the fund link through a roadside flyer stapled to a power pole. Need a hand? No interest, just honesty. He thought it was a scam, but desperation makes a man bold. He filled out the form from his phone, expecting nothing. The next morning, a message came, approved for relief.
Check your account.
He blinked at the number, small but enough to fill his tank, buy food, and get home. At the bottom of the message was a note. When you're steady again, pass that forward. That line stuck in him. Weeks later, when his rig was running and work came back, Eli started leaving a portion of every paycheck in that same account for the next fool like me, he said. He never knew the fund history, never read the ledgers or heard Silas' name, but he carried the creed without realizing. Patience had moved from paper to people to pulse. Years rolled by. More names joined. The fund became a web, a network of giving and repaying that no corporation could quite understand. Economists tried to study it, called it peer-based microfinance with moral equity, but no model could explain why it worked so well. The truth was older than economics. It worked because trust still paid better than interest, and in that trust, the spirit of Barrel Creek lived on, somewhere, Far from the old ridge, a young woman named Lena worked nights at a diner saving to open her own bakery. When her oven broke 2 weeks before opening day, she logged into the fund app. Her request was small. The money came within hours. She cried over her phone, whispering thanks to no one and everyone. Later, when her business flourished, she became a lender herself. Patience loans, she called them, a phrase she didn't know she'd borrowed from Silas Ghost. The fund began inspiring other groups' communities, rebuilding after storms, teachers pooling wages to help students, farmers sharing crop data to survive droughts. They used technology, but what moved through the wires wasn't code, it was faith. Every transaction was a lantern on the old prairie, passed hand to hand through time. No one could say exactly when the legend returned. Maybe it was an article in a digital archive, or maybe a researcher found the scanned copy of Silas' first ledger. Whatever the spark, the story of the quiet banker of Barrel Creek began to circle lead, told in classrooms, podcasts, and coffee shops. People quoted him without knowing if he had truly existed. Slow gold runs quiet, runs deep. It became a proverb, a warning, a philosophy. The creed had outlived its authors once more. And yet, even in the world spun faster, algorithms trading fortunes in microseconds, data replacing decisions, somewhere there was always a small group of people slowing it back down. Farmers in Nebraska who refused to automate everything, artists in New York who shared profits evenly, engineers who designed networks that couldn't be exploited. They called it the McAllen ethic, though most just called it common sense. If you drove through what used to be Barrel Creek at night, you'd see little more than dark plains and a few solar towers blinking red against the horizon. But if you parked, stepped out, and listened, really listened, you could hear the soft hum of energy moving from one place to another. It sounded wind across a ledger, or maybe like rain tapping the old co-op roof. Either way, it was the same rhythm Silas had heard once in his own heartbeat. Patience made visible, fairness made real, and maybe that's how the world keeps turning after all. Not on greed or glory, but on the quiet weight of hands that give what they can and ask little in return. Gold still runs, only now it hums through circuits and code instead of dust and coin, but it to say gold, the slow kind, the deep kind, the kind that endures when everything else burns away. Maybe it was the wind that started talking again, or maybe it was just the earth remembering, but stories have a way of coming whole even when no one left to welcome them, long after the last McAllen ledger had gone digital, after Ruth's name had faded into server logs and the Barrel Fund was just another piece of open source code. The story began to whisper once more, not through books or screens, but through people sitting around their own kind of campfires. They weren't cowboys now, not in the old sense. They were dreamers with laptops, farmers with solar rigs, single mothers trading child care hours, students running community servers out of garages. Every one of them was trying to make something last in a world that burned through everything too fast. When they spoke of patience, they didn't advance words. They said things like, give it time, or we'll make it steady. And somehow those plain words carried the same weight Silas' slow drawl in the rain. Some nights, a few of them would gather in old barns that still smelled faintly of hay and lightning. They'd light lanterns, tell stories of the first man who built a bank out of nothing but fairness, of a woman who ran it on sunlight and trust, of a town that survived every storm by remembering not to rush. Nobody knew if those stories were true anymore, but truth wasn't the taint. The story itself had become a kind of currency, a wealth you couldn't counterfeit. Every retelling added interest. Every listener became an investor. One of those listeners was a young coder named Mason. He lived far from Barrel Creek, half a world away in a city that never knew silence, but he carried that same hunger Silas once had, the hunger for something that didn't vanish when the markets crashed or the lights flickered out. He found the story buried in his online archive, a scanned photograph of old ledger page, yellowed and cracked, the ink nearly gone, but the words were still there, faint in a ghost and twice as strong. Slow gold runs quiet, runs deep. Maine read that line 100 times. It felt like a secret someone had left just for him. develop a small network to beat Gold Digital Co-op that matched creators with investors, not through contracts, but through shared code. Every transaction was transparent, every profit divided by effort, not status. The system ran on something he called proof of patience, a measure of time held, not wealth earned, and somehow it worked. Slowly at first, then steadily, quietly. The same rhythm, be the rain on Silas' old roof. Journalists tried to make it sound like a revolution. Mason Zunt smiled and said, "It ain't new. It just remembered. He'd never seen Barrow Creek, never walked its soil, but he built a digital map of it anyway, down to the ridge, the windmill, and the co-op walls. He said it helped remind him where the story started, even if he couldn't prove it was real." Over time, people began visiting that virtual Barrow Creek. They'd wander through it like pilgrims, reading plaques that told fragments of the tale, hearing the wind hum through old wires. When they reached the ridge, there were 3 markers carved into the digital stone: Silas, Henry, Walter, and next to them a newer one, Ruth. The 4th marker didn't have a name. It just said, "Yours to carry." No one knew who'd added it. Maybe Mason, maybe the network itself, maybe the story had learned how to write again. But every visitor paused there, awed with tears in their eyes, just smiling without knowing why. The story had come full circle once more, passed through hands, hearts, and hard tides, until it became the same thing it always was. A promise that fairness never dies, it just changes shape. And somewhere beyond code and sky and memory, if you listened close, you could almost hear that same old cowboy voice. "Warm a whiskey, slow a thunder. Gold ain't what you dig, son, it's what you keep alive. Patience will make you rich if you give her time." The wind answered in time, rushing across digital hills and real ones alike, carrying that line to new mouths and new storms. For as long as people still traded trust for time and kindness for return, the ledger would stay open, the balance would hold, and the world, no matter how modern, no matter how loud, would still hum the same quiet tune: "Slow gold runs quiet." Slow gold runs deep. And it was how the legend of Barrow Creek outlasted both paper and man, by remembering that a fortune worth keeping is never made of what glitters, but of what endures. Long after Mason Project had folded into the bones of the internet, absorbed, rebranded, renamed, the ghost of Barrow Creek kept walking. It was not a place anymore, not even a network. It was a pulse, soft a heart under dust. It lived in the way a grandmother saved a little from every paycheck for someone else's need. It lived in the way small towns pooled labor to rebuild a barn after a fire. It lived wherever patience was louder than panic, wherever fairness still meant something. People forgot where the phrase came from, but to say held slow gold, they'd whisper when times got tight. It became a superstition in they places, a charm, a warning. Traders carved it into the undersides of desks. Soldiers scratched it into helmets before battle. Sail low painted it beneath the rails of their ships. The words themselves were like a lantern flame that refused to die, flickering across centuries. By the late years of that new century, money itself had turned near invisible, flowing through invisible threads of data too fought for human eyes to fold. But with speed came fragility. When systems glitch and fortunes vanished in seconds, there were always people who'd built something slower, smaller, steadier. They were the ones who fed their neighbors when banks froze.
They were the ones whose wealth couldn't be measured in digital zeros. They hid their gatherings creeks, in quiet tribute to an origin most of them didn't remember. One such creek met once a month under a crumbling viaduct on the edge of a floodplain city. They brought food, shared skills, mended bikes, traded time for time. They weren't rebels, they were repairers, folks who wanted to keep the world from tearing too fat. The group elder was an old woman named May, with silver hair and a scar across one cheek. She kept oil lamp burning through every meeting, though the others teased her for it. Light, they'd say. Why oil when you've got LEDs? May would smile. Because oil don't panic when the power goes out. Nobody knew her story, but she spoke like a woman who'd seen too many winters to be surprised by anything. And every meeting ended the same way. She'd open a small wooden box, take out a folded scrap of paper and read aloud, "Slow gold runs quiet, runs deep." Then he'd nod once and say, "That's the rule." Someone once asked what the line came from, and she said, "Old man told it to me in a dream, said his name was Silas." They laughed, figuring she meant her granddad or a ghost story. But she never smiled back. "Dreams don't lie if you wait long enough to listen," she said. The creek grew.
From one city to another, people copied May ritual. The oil lamp, the reading, the promise. Within a decade, there were thousands of lamps burning around the world-tiny circles of light in basements, rooftops, warehouses. They shared goods, knowledge, and calm. The rich called them quaint. The poor called them family. And when the next big blackout came, when data froze and commerce crashed, those lamps were the only lights left. Governments tried to study it, scholars tried to name it, but none could map where it began or how it spread. They said it was leaderless, faith without scripture, commerce without greed. The people who lived it just called it the hollow, a word that slipped out of vile, old pail and found a new home. No one could say why they chose it, but maybe the story had been wandering through them on a long, whispering its way down the long corridors of time. And through it, the rain kept falling somewhere on steel roofs, glass towers, solar fields, and the bare ridges that once held the bones of Barrow Creek. The sound of it was the same as it had to been, steady, patient, unending. Some swore if you stood out there long enough and listened, you could still hear voices beneath it. Men talking slow, wind laughing soft, pens scratching across paper. The world had changed every way it could, but that sound of rain meeting earth, of time meeting trust, was eternal. Maybe that's how legacies survive. Not through monuments or memory, but through rhythm. The rhythm of patience breathing through people, too humble to call it a miracle. The rhythm of a story that never needed a name to be true. The rhythm of gold that still runs, quiet and deep. When the storms rolled through that year, they weren't storms of weather, but of memory power grids down. Cities dim, satellites blind for days at a time. It was the first true silence humanity had heard in 100 years. No buzz of traffic, no hum of devices, no endless chatter of screens. In that silence, something older stirred, like the heartbeat of the earth waking from a long sleep. The world slowed because it had no choice, and in that slowing, people began to notice each other again. The creeks, those circles of oil lamps and patience, became sanctuaries. They weren't organized, but they didn't need to be. Each lamp was its own signal, a promise in the dark. Families theirs around them reading aloud the old words written on scraps, printouts, tattoos. Slow gold runs quiet, runs deep. Nobody knew where it had come from, but it felt like scripture. Some claimed it was from an ancient poet. Others said it was born from a forgotten rancher diary. Only a few of the oldest remembered hearing whispers of a place called Barrow Creek, though even that sounded a myth, too human, too small to have mattered so much. But the myth was alive now, moving like water through the cracks of civilization. Communities began keeping their own ledgers again, paper ones, real ink, real names. They tracked favors, food shared, work done, promises kept. It wasn't nostalgia, it was survival. Sustenance built on speed had collapsed, and only those who knew how to wait were still standing. Every ledger became a prayer, and every signature a heartbeat. Among the flicker of one of those lamps sat a boy named Aaron, no older than 15, eyes bright with that same restless curiosity that once made Silas McCallan mend fences for pennies. He had never seen a farm, but he'd read about them. He'd never held a real coin, only the plastic cards of a world that no longer worked. His grandmother kept the creek ledger, and each night she'd let him write one line before bed. "Does it matter what you write?" she told him, "as long as it's honest?" At first he scribbled nonsense weather notes, jokes, sketches, but one night when rain hammered the roof hard enough to drown thought, he asked her, "Why do we keep writing?" Then no one left to read it. She smiled, her eyes catching the lamplight. "We don't write so someone will read it, child. We write so it'll wait for them when they do." That night Aaron stayed awake long after she'd gone to sleep, stared at the pages, yellowing fast in the damp air, and felt a strange warmth in his chest, as if unseen hands were guiding his pen. Without thinking, he wrote a line he didn't understand. "Gold ain't what you dig, it's what you keep alive." When he looked back at it, he couldn't remember thinking the words. They that came, like a voice whispered from the other side of time. The next morning, he found his grandmother reading the page, tears in her eyes. "That the line," she whispered. "That the one they said he spoke?" "Who?" Aaron asked. But she didn't answer. She just reached out and squeezed his hand, her thumb tracing circles the way Silas once did on his ledger cover. That afternoon, she told everyone at the creek. They copied the phrase and passed it on. Within months, it was everywhere, spray-painted on walls, stitched into jackets, carved into stone. The world was rebuilding slower this time, and those who built it knew better now. Value was not in speed or shine or promise. It was in what survived the storm. Years later, when the lights of the new world blinked back on, no one quite remembered how the blackout had ended. Some said it was engineers, some said it was faith, but most agreed it was patience that saved them. And when the networks came alive again, every device in the creek system, every terminal, every lamp-logged node displayed a sealed message on startup. Raro Creek online. LEGDAT. Running quiet. No one had programmed it. No one claimed credit. The code simply carried on, whispering its way through 1,000 machines that refused to forget. The story had finally outgrown its storytellers, and still the rain fell. Not the punishment, but the rhythm. It fell on steel and soil, on wind towers and forgotten graves, on children learning to measure wealth by trust again. Somewhere in the soft thunder and hum of the returning world, an old voice could still be heard if you listened that right. A drawl worn smooth by time and kindness. Patience will make you rich if you give her time. The sound echoed between data and dust, between circuits in memory, and the world, weary and wiser, whispered back, "We remember." Time moved again, though it moved different this time, less like a race, more like the slow turning of a wheel that knew exactly where it was headed. The world rebuilt itself not in towers of glass, but in circles of light, little towns and digital enclaves that hummed with quiet trade. People worked hard more than they competed, and when they did compete, it was just testing skill, not greed. There were still the loud ones, the fast ones, the men who swore they could reinvent wealth with one more algorithm, but the rest of the world had grown patient enough to let them shout. Noise, after all, dies quicker than silence. Barrow Creek, that once forgotten valley, became a myth you could walk through in. We remember time moved together, though it moved different this time, less like a race, more like the slow turning of a wheel that knew exactly where it was headed. The world rebuilt itself not in towers of glass, but in circles of light, little towns and digital enclaves that hummed with quiet trade. People worked hard more than they competed, and when they did compete, it was testing skill, not greed. There were still the loud ones, the fast ones, the men who swore they could reinvent wealth with one more algorithm, but the rest of the world had grown patient enough to let them shout. Noise, after all, dies quicker than silence. Barrow Creek, that once forgotten valley, became a myth you could walk through in. Tourists came to see the place where. The guides told it, finance found its conscience. They stood on the ridge where the windmill used to creak and stared at the wide horizon, trying to feel what the old cowboy had felt when he wrote those first words in his ledger. Some swore they heard a whisper in the wind, others said it was just imagination, but the guide smiled and let them wonder. Imagination, after all, was the only real inheritance the creek had it offered. The new town that rose there was not much, just a few houses, a library built from the co-op remains, and a museum that didn't charge admission. The museum didn't show artifacts or jewels, just paper, the ledgers, copied 100 times, pages of looping handwriting and smudged ink. Visitors ran their fingers over the words as though touching scripture. Slow gold runs quiet, runs deep. Beneath that, the curators had written, founder unknown, philosophy eternal, once a year on the anniversary of the old flood that nearly wiped the valley clean, folks there at dusk. They didn't celebrate wealth, they celebrated endurance. The ceremony was simple, one lamp lit, passed from hand to hand and a wide circle until everyone's face caught its light. They called it the return of the flame. Children read from the ledgers, elders told stories of Silas, Henry, Ruth, and May, not as saints, but that examples of how ordinary people hold the world together.
The youngest always asked the same question. Were they real? And the oldest always answered, real enough to last? In the rebuilt cities far away, a few economists began studying the legend seriously. They traced it through code, through lone networks, through oral history. They found fragments of names, documents, and grain records from the late 800s, enough to suggest the story might have started with a rancher named McAllen after a. But even they stopped short of proving it. Proof, one scholar wrote, as a luxury of impatience. The truth of Barrow Creek is not whether it happened, but whether it keeps happening. Well, it did keep happening. The philosophy of slow gold seeped up into boardrooms and classrooms. Some called it ethical finance, called it sustainable economics, but those who lived it didn't bother naming it. It was simply the way things were done. Investments moved slower, debts were personal again, and the word trust found its way back into contracts. In the quiet corners of this new era, you could find murals of a weather-the cowboy with a notebook, lantern light glowing behind him. No halo, no monument, just a man keeping his word. There were still storms, there will always be storms, but they didn't hit hard as they used to, because people had learned how to wait them out. They'd built barns with thicker walls, networks with longer memories, hearts with room enough for mercy.
And somewhere between the hum of solar grids and the soft tapping of rain, the creed of Barrow Creek still whispered through every current: patience is wealth, trust is capital, fairness is legacy. Generating later, a child born under a digital sky would ask her teacher, "What a ledger?" The teacher smiled and held up a small hand-bound book. "It how people remembered what mattered," she said. The child opened it, saw blank pages, and asked, "Ever you supposed to fill it?" The teacher laughed. We to drew. That the deal. That night, that same child dreamed of a prairie under thunderclouds, a wooden house lit from within, and a man in a wide-brimmed hat riding by candlelight. He looked up once, eyes kind, voice low. "If you forget the math, just count the time you've got left and spend it fair," he said. When he woke, she didn't remember the dream clear, only the feeling that something old had trusted her with its story. She went to school and wrote 3 words on the cover of her notebook: "Slow gold forever." And maybe that's how it ends, or how it always keeps beginning. The ledger isn't closed, it just passed along. The ink doesn't fade, it only waits for the next hand. Somewhere out there, under a sky split by lightning and rain, an old voice still hums its tune, quiet but sure. Slow gold runs quiet. Slow gold runs deep. Patience make you rich if you give her time, and the earth listens, the rain answers, and the circle holds. Same as it did. Same as it always will. Long after even the epilogues had been written and the names of Silas, Henry, and Ruth became no more than gentle syllables folded into history dust, the land itself seemed to breathe the lesson. Grass still bent to the wind, rivers still carved slow patience into the rock, and the rain still spoke the same tongue. It was quieter now, falling on solar glass instead of tin roofs, but its rhythm hadn't changed. It said the same thing it had always said: wait and grow. There were few left who remembered what Barrow Creek had once been. The new cities of that far century were grown from algorithms and light, their streets mapped by drones, their markets watched by machines that thought faster than the human heart could beat. Yet even those machines, coded by the descendants of the patient, carried in them a whisper of that old arithmetic. One line of code hidden deep, due to overreach. It had been passed down unconsciously from one generation of engineers to the next, like a superstition. They didn't know where it came from, only that systems ran smoother when it was there. One such city, glittering over what used to be the plains, called itself New Meridian. It stretched from horizon to horizon, towers like metal grass blades under a copper sky. Down among its roots lived a man named Jonah Vale, a systems auditor whose job was to slow things down to catch overflows before they broke the grid. Most thought his work dull, a relic of the pre-automation age, but Jonah took pride in it. He liked to say, "The world still needs brakes, even if it thinks it's flying." We'd never heard of Barrow Creek, but the old drawl came through when he spoke, of ancestors he'd never met. He kept a notebook in his coat pocket, a paper one, though everyone else used tablets. He said the paper helped him think slower. Each night he'd write small notes, that the city power surged too fast, where greed slipped into code. He'd draw boxes and arrows, patient day a rancher mapping fences, making sure everything held. His co-workers teased him for it. "You're obsolete, Jonah. The system corrects itself." But one season, the system didn't. It collapsed all at once. Every algorithm chasing profit so fast the grid starved itself. Lights failed, elevators froze, transit stopped. Panic rippled like wildfire through the towers. Jonah was the only one still calm. He went home, lit a candle, the kind his grandfather used to keep for blackouts, and opened his paper notebook. In its pages were lines of hand-drawn code, slow loops, fail-safes he'd been drafting for years. He walked to the control station, keyed them in manually, one command at a time. A grid breathed again, not perfectly, but steady. And in that slowness, the city remembered itself. Power returned not in a flood, but in waves, each one measured, patient, controlled. People said later that the system had fixed itself, that a miracle of design had prevented collapse. But Jonah knew. He'd written the miracle by hand years ago when he first scrawled in his notebook. "Gold ain't what you dig, it's what you keep alive." Afterward, they made him director of the audit program. He refused most honors but accepted one, the right to build a small memorial garden on the city's southern edge. He filled it with wild grasses, slow streams, and a single wooden bench. On that bench, he carved 3 words, "Slow gold, forever." He didn't know why that phrase felt right. He only knew that when the rain came, it sang on the bench like a hymn. Children visited the garden for field trips, teachers calling it the quiet park. They'd ask about the phrase, and guides would shrug. Old saying, they'd say, means patience is profit. But 10 of those children would grow up and carry the words with them, repeating them like a secret blessing, for they made decisions, for they signed contracts, for they fell asleep. The phrase passed through time like water through stone, never vanishing, only shaping. Centuries later, when paper itself became rare and digital records were all but immortal, a historian found Jonah's old notebook in a vault. It is brittle, half-faded, its first pages torn. But on the inside cover, written in careful penmanship, were the same words that had once filled the ledgers of Barrel Creek. Slow gold runs, quiet, runs deep. The historian traced them with a fingertip and smiled. Whoever he was, she said, he understood the math of the soul. That night, rain swept across New Meridian, washing light from the towers. In the garden, the bench stood empty, slick with water. The stream swelled, the grasses bent, and the air filled with the scent of clean earth. Somewhere in the sound, carried between thunder and memory, a voice spoke again, softer than the wind but steady at edge. You keep it alive and it'll keep you. The voice faded, but the rain went on, and as long as the rain went on, so did the lesson, written not in ink or code, but in the rhythm of the living world, the math of patience, the wealth of endurance, the quiet truth that outlasts every empire. The city called New Meridian aged the way an old horse does, still strong but slower, content to watch the new colt run. Centuries of noise softened into something almost musical. What began in the hum of engines became in time a low harmony of rivers, turbines, and wind. Nobody owned anything outright anymore. Ownership had been replaced by stewardship. You didn't buy land, you tended it. You didn't sell your labor, you lent 10. The pace of Feist was steady enough that a man could look at a seed and expect to see it sprout before he died. That was wealth enough. In the center of the quiet park, the bench still waited. The words carved into it had worn shallow from countless fingers tracing them, slow gold forever. Children rubbed those letters like a charm before exams. Lovers pressed palms against them when they swore oaths. On wet days, the rain led inside the grooves and made them shine. The historians called it a relic. The people called it a reminder. The bench didn't mind what it was sowed. It just stayed Betwayze, the creed itself. One dawn, a maintenance worker named Nia came to check the irrigation lines that ran through the park. She wasn't a believer in legends. She believed in schedules and tools. But when he sat down on the bench to rest, the air felt heavier, as if it remembered more than she did. She noted an old crack beneath the seat and reached inside to clear of moss. Her hand came back holding a coin. It wasn't currency, just a round disc of dull brass, hand stamped with the words, Raro Creek, So-Op on 894. Nia turned it over in her palm, curious. On the other side was a faint engraving of a windmill, and beneath it, the smallest inscription she'd seen. Keep it alive. She slipped it into her pocket, thinking she'd give it to the archives later. But that evening, when the city lights flickered from a distant storm, she found herself holding the coin again. The brass was warm, almost pulsing. Without meaning to, she whispered the words aloud. The lights steady. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe not. Word of the coin spread after she showed it to her supervisor. The City Historical Commission traced its composition, brass, iron, and a trace of prairie dust not found anywhere near New Meridian. The analysis confirmed what nobody dared say. It was genuine. The last surviving piece of the old McAllen Supply Company carried somehow through centuries of forgetting. They placed it in a glass case by the bench, and for the first time in generations, people lined up to see something older than their machines. Children asked what it meant. Teachers tried to explain interest, fairness, patience, trust. But one old professor from the archives said it best. That coin isn't money. It's proof that memory pays compound interest. Soon, small copies of the coin began to appear, printed on biodegradable polymer, passed from hand to hand. They weren't used to buy things. They were tokens of time. If someone helped repair your roof, you gave them a coin. If a neighbor watered your crops while you were ill, a coin changed hands. No banks tracked them. No laws enforced them. Yet somehow, the balance always worked. The people called them creek coins, and using one became a gesture of respect more than transaction. When Nia grew old, she often returned to that bench, watching the younger ones trade their tokens, hearing the soft jingle of brass like rainfall. She liked to think the city had finally learned how to breathe again. On her last evening, as twilight folded over the park, she felt rain starting to fall slow, steady, familiar. She closed her eyes and whispered, "You kept it alive, didn't you?" No one was near enough to hear the voice that answered, but the grass bent in the same direction all at once, as if bowing to her. The rain thickened, warm and golden under the setting sun, and for one impossible heartbeat, the air smelled like wet hay and wood smoke. Then it was gone. After her passing, the city renamed the park the Hollow. No plaques, no grand speeches, just that name and the bench, and the quiet promise that had carried through unbroken centuries. Every year, on the first night of the rainy season, people still gather there. They light oil lamps, not that they need them, because they remember what it means to wait through darkness with faith in dawn. Some recite the line carved long ago, simply listen. All of them understand the lesson whether they speak it or not. The rain, falling slow and patient, speaks it for them. Gold ain't what you dig, it's what you keep alive. And the world keeps on breathing soft and deliberate, rich and in the ways that never needed counting. Every civilization eventually comes to a moment when it has to remember how to listen. The people of New Meridian reached that point quietly. The towers still gleamed, the network still hummed, but the pace of life had fallen into rhythm with the turning of seasons again. Children were taught that profit was not a number on a screen, but a measure of how much peace you left in your wake. They learned arithmetic and compassion side by side. There were still markets, but they moved of tides instead of storms, predictable, gentle, sustainable. The Barrow Creed had done its work. A century later, travelers from another colony world came to see the Hollow. They'd grown none on terraformed soil, with no memory of rain or wind, and they came to study how an old world had endured. The guides told them about Silas McAllen, though by then he was less man than myth, a symbol of steadiness, a whisper wrapped in dust. The visitors stood in silence by the bench where the rain began to fall, listening to its soft pat. None spoke until one young woman asked, "So all this started with a farmer notebook?" The guide smiled. "Oh, Mom, it started with a man who counted what mattered. They left small offerings on the bench, metal slivers from their machines, seeds from their hydro farms, little tokens of gratitude. The rain washed over them, binding earth and sky, memory and future. Some said the air shimmered for a moment, as if the world itself had exhaled, and maybe it had." For the truth of Barrow Creek was never about money. It was about measure. The measure of patience against time, of kindness against need, of work against worth. Wealth, in its purest form, was nothing more than balance. That idea had survived wars, droughts, data collapses, and centuries of forgetting. It had threaded itself into the fabric of humanity like a stitch that refused to come loose. Out in the frontier colonies, the settlers began using the same principles. They built 2 towns called Creeks, Aurora Creek, Hollow Bend, Second Barrow. Each one had a lamp at its center, burning through the night, symbolizing a promise of fair trade and steady living. Their ledgers were written on crystal tablets now, but the handwriting was still patient, deliberate. When they spoke of history, they didn't talk about kings or revolutions. They talked about the time when the world slowed down and remembered its heartbeat. In one of those settlements, a small outpost on a red desert moon, a man named Elias worked then an agronomist guiding water across cracked plains. The settlers there struggled with storms of dust instead of rain. One night, while checking the irrigation valves, Elias uncovered an old shipping crate buried beneath a dude. Inside, sealed in resin, was a thin book. Its cover was brittle, its pages yellowed, but the words were still legible. Ledger of Silas and Calvin. He turned the pages carefully, eyes wide at the neat handwriting and the simple equations scrawled beside bits of philosophy. Don't lend what you can't teach. Don't buy what you can't fix. Don't count faster than you can pray. Read until dawn, and by sunrise he'd made a choice. That day he reorganized the colony resources. He rewrote their system so that water was distributed not by rank or quota, but by contribution and care. It was risky, even rebellious. But the next season, when drought hit and every other settlement nearby withered, Hollow Bend held. When reporters came, they asked Elias how he'd done it. He said only, "Slow gold." The word spread again, lighting through the colonies like sparks on dry grass. The creed returned, dressed in new language, but the code was the same. They began carving those 2 words, slow gold, on their machines, their walls, their hearts. And once more, humanity found its rhythm through the echo of a long-dead cowboy riding in the lamplight. By the time Elias grew old, he'd turned that ledger into a teaching book. Children learned the 3 measures of the Creek: fairness, foresight, and faith. Every graduate received a copy bound in recycled paper with 1 blank page at the back. On that page, they were told to write the rule they lived by. Some wrote about trade, some about patience, some simply wrote, "Keep it alive," and so it was kept. Across stars and centuries, through dust and cold, though hands had never met but somehow recognized each other, the gold kept running. Quiet, deep. Sometimes, when the night was calm and the wind blew across the desert, Elias would sit outside and swear he could hear a faint sound. Not the wheel turbines or the hiss of shifting sand, but the creak of an old windmill turning in rhythm with the universe itself. It made him smile. "You're still out there, aren't you, Silas?" he whispered. "Still keeping count." The wind never answered, but maybe it didn't have to. Some truths don't need to speak. They just keep standing, like a bench in the rain or a ledger waiting for the next hand. The sound of patience is its own reply. And long after Elias' light went out, the wind kept moving through that place slow, soft, certain. The rhythm stayed the same. When the last of the frontier moons had been charted and humanity maps filled with more stars than blankness, the legend of Barrow Creek still refused to fade. It drifted through space the way old songs drifts through campfire smoke carried by voices that half remembered the melody but knew the feeling by heart. We called it by many names now. The creed of the quiet flame, the patience equation, the hollow law, but the story at its center never changed. Somewhere in the long-ago dust of a blue world, a man had written in his ledger that gold was what you kept alive. On the colony world of Meridian 5, a place of violet skies and seas that glowed at night, the settlers built their first great city in a crater valley and caved it Creekhaven. They said it was because the rain pooled there naturally and because patience had to start at the lowest point before it could rise. The people of Creekhaven did not worship wealth, they cultivated it. Their marketplace was a quiet affair, run without noise or haggling. You placed your goods, waited, trusted. No advertisements, no brokers, no deception. It was an economy built on reputation and rhythm. The scholars called it absurd. The citizens called it freedom. Every evening when the two suns fell and the air turned lavender, the city lights dimmed automatically, leaving only lanterns glowing in doorways. The people led in the central square for counting of kindness, a ritual where they read names instead of numbers. This person repaired a bridge. This one taught 5 children to read. This one stayed through the storm. The measure of the day wasn't profit, but contribution. They didn't keep tallies, they kept memory. At the heart of the square stood a circular monument carved from stone, so old it had outlasted every empire before it. Inside its face was etched a Sin phrase in 23 languages. Slow gold runs quiet, runs deep. No one knew who had brought those words hid across light years, but every colonist swore the letters glowed faintly when the rain fell. The priests of patience said it was condensation and phosphorescence. The farmers said it was blessing. Either way, no one had cleaned the monument. They said the water did the work better than any hand. Among the settlers was a young engineer named Tessa Vale, a descendant by rumor or coincidence of the same Jonah who had once saved New Meridian. She designed energy grids that flowed like water, slower and safer than the frantic systems of the older world. Her peers mocked her for refusing to ease acceleration algorithms. Efficiency is progress, they said. Tessa only smiled. Progress without mercy is erosion. Her systems never failed. When a magnetic storm swept through the planet's sky and crippled every other colony grid, Creekhaven lights stayed on. People asked her how she'd done it. She tapped the inscription on the monument, "I just let it run quiet." As years passed, Tessa became something like the Silas of her age, respected, stubborn, kind in a way that felt solid. She never built an empire, never wrote a manifesto, but she did keep a small journal beside her drafting board. She called it the maintenance ledger, and she didn't list parts or payments, only lessons. Patience and design are the same muscle. Speed hides mistakes. Slowness but pays them. Every system deserves time to rest. The book became her companion for decades, passed to her apprentices after her death. They made copies, adding their own notes and margins. The ledger grew generation by generation until it filled libraries. Centuries later, when Creekhaven had become a jewel city on a planet ringed with satellites, a digital copy of that ledger was placed aboard a probe bound for the next star. The inscription engraved on its hull read, "For whoever finds this, patience is wealth." The probe sailed into darkness, carrying not data or maps or technology, but a philosophy older than any machine, older even than the stars that guided it. Somewhere in the infinite black, it would drift, waiting. The universe, like Silas McCallan once said, always pays back what waits long enough. On clear nights, the citizens of Creekhaven would still see the rain, thin silver threads falling through violet dusk. They'd tilt their heads back and listen to the sound of it striking metal roofs and stone paths. It didn't thunder, it whispered, and in that whisper was the air of every man and woman who'd lived by patience. From the rancher pen to the engineer stylist, from dust to data, the say truth held somewhere in that endless continuum, maybe beyond the reach of any charted star, there is still a campfire burning. Around it the air smells of rain on earth and the faint sweetness of smoke. A figure leans forward, notebook open on his knee. He hums softly as he waits. The pen, steady, even in wind, brushes his hat brim. His voice carries over the flames, timeless, worn in time. Slow gold runs quiet. Slow gold runs deep. The rest of it, well, the rest don't last. The fire pops, the rain answers, and the story, his story, the world's story, turns one more patient page. Across the centuries, the probe bearing Creekhaven ledger kept its silent course through the dark. It did not hum or flash, did not waste a spark of energy, announcing itself to the emptiness. It was built to wait, just as the creed had always taught. Radiation flared around it, met Teddier's path close enough to whisper, but the probe endured. Somewhere in its metal heart was a copy of every rule Silas McAllen had lived by, translated into the language of light and time. It didn't know what patience was, not in any human sense, but it lived it the same. 1,000 years later, a different ship found it. The vessel was called Hearthseed, crewed by explorers who carried entire gardens aboard, orchards grown under glass, flowers that bloomed to recycled rain. When they intercepted the probe, they launched into their cargo bay like a relic rescued from myth. The captain, a woman named Mira Shale, had never seen anything so humble. No weapons, no wealth, no flag, she said, brushing frost from the hull. Just words. They opened the probe expecting coordinates or formulas and found instead a message etched on the co-inner plate. It was simple, as how lasting things are. To whoever reads this, wealth is what endures after storms. If you're still out here, you've already understood. The explorers read it in silence. They were used to messages of conquest, discovery, victory. This one felt like a whisper across eternity. They uploaded the ledger file and began reading during the long nights between stars. The ship grew quieter, work slowed but became steadier. Arguments vanished. For the first time in years, nobody rushed. Strange thing, Mira said in her log, the slower we move, the more we see. By the time Hearthseed reached its destination, a small planet covered in rivers and silver forests, the crew had built their own ritual. They ended each shift by writing a single line in a shared journal. Not about what they'd done, but about what they'd learned waiting. They called the rook the ship Patience, and when they founded their new colony, they named it Second Hollow. No grand monuments, no cathedrals, just a round house at the center of a field with a bench inside. On the wall above the bench, carved in the same old words that had crossed galaxies, slow gold runs quiet, runs deep. The settlers of Second Hollow lived by that creed as if it were written into their blood. They built their society not on currency, but on time. Every citizen was given a set number of hours each month to trade or give. Work, care, teaching, all paid in time. There were no poor, no rich, only those who gave more than they took. The system baffled economists on distant worlds. It can't scale, they said, but it did. It grew slow, like everything that lasts. Children learned the story of the cowboy who built a fortune from patience, the banker who lent kindness instead of coin, the woman who kept her lights on through the storm. They said those names the way old priests say prayers soft, reverent, sure. Silas, Henry, Ruth, Jonah, Tessa. They were no longer people, they were elements. Earth, fire, water, air, time. The fire that kept the hollow alive, and still the rain fell. The settlers had brought with them seeds from Creekhaven Old Garn, and when the first storms came, the soil accepted them gladly. The crops grew slow but strong, roots deep with faith. When harvest came, they gave the first portion to the sea. Not their offering, but their reminder, what we keep, we lose. What we share, we earn again. Generations passed, machines changed, skies shifted, stars burned out and were born again, yet the hollow remained. Every few years, a traveler would arrive from another system, weary and worn, seeking something that couldn't be bought. They'd find the bench, the rain, the ledger still being copied by hand, the people still moving at the rhythm of heartbeats instead of profit. And in that stillness, they'd understand. One traveler, an old philosopher named Alain Corso, wrote, "I have found the richest place in the universe, and it does not glitter, it breathes." His writing spread farther than any market report, carried by word of mouth through ports and colonies, through languages that barely shared roots. Everywhere it went, people slowed it a little. Markets paused before opening. Contracts were read twice instead of once. The legend was working gig. And when the elders of Second Hollow laid for their centennial, they didn't give speeches. They simply opened the latest ledger, set it on the bench, and let the rain fall upon it. The ink belled slightly, forming shapes that looked almost like new woo. Someone leaned close and swore they read the phrase, "If you kept it alive," whether it was true or imagination didn't matter. The meaning was the same. Above them, stars flickered through the mist, patient, a lantern's end, in infinite sky. And if you listen closely to the patter of rain and the quiet of content hearts, you might still hear that old voice somewhere, drifting across galaxies and years alike, whispering to whoever will listen, "Keep it alive and it'll keep you." It said that when enough years pass, even time begins to age. That what happened out in the far rim, where the descendants of Second Hollow built their quiet stations among the stars, they no longer remembered what a cowboy was, or a ledger, or even what gold looked like. But they remembered patience. They remembered fairness. They remembered the sound of rain, even though none of them had seen it. They played recordings of it during their rest cycles, soft white noise threaded through their ship hulls to remind themselves that calm was wealth. Those who lived on the edge of known space thought themselves keepers of the hollow. They weren't an order or a government, but wanderers who carried stories instead of laws. Every keeper kept a sealed book blank at the start of their travels, filled only if they met people worth remembering. The books weren't for fame, they were ledgers of gratitude, to mark who made the waiting worthwhile. One keeper said. Among them was a man named Horror Cag. He was older than most, hair silver ship-like, voice low, a storm far off the horizon. He wore a wide coat with patches from a dozen colonies, and in the inside pocket he carried a tiny brass coin, one side worn smooth, the other still faintly reading Barrow Creek Co-op. He'd found it in the archives of an abandoned relay station and kept it for since. It wasn't luck he carried, but memory. When he held it, he felt connected to something vast, as if patience itself had weight, or drifted from world to world, repairing what others left broken. He didn't ask payment, just a place to sit and a story to hear. Stories, he said, are the only currency that grows in the telling. On frozen moons, miners welcomed him by their fires. In ocean domes, farmers brewed him tea from saltwater kelp. And always before he left, he'd give them one of his blank pages, now filled with their own tale written in his weather Erutan. "Ledger not mine," he'd say. "I keep it moving." It was Orr who brought the creed back to worlds that had forgotten stillness. His voice carried the weight of thunder softened by age. When corporations spoke of speed, he told them of endurance. When they praised innovation, he reminded them of consequence. And when they laughed, he smiled and said, "The faster you move, the shorter you last." People listened. They always did, as behind his calm was something no one could fake, proof that he'd outwaited the storms they feared. He died, as all patient men do, quietly, not on a battlefield, not in glory, but seated on a hill of a new colony, where windmills turned slow under the twin suns. Children found him at dawn, hat resting over his eyes, that brass coin still warm in his palm. They buried him there, and someone carved his epitaph from the words in his journal. He waited well. Years later, when settlers came to that planet in search of work, they found the windmills still turning, each one engraved with a sealed phrase at its base. Not the engineer mark, not a manufacturer stamp, but 5 words carved in steady script. "Slow gold runs quiet, runs deep." No one knew who had carved them, but every traveler who saw the mills swore they felt lighter leaving than when they'd arrived. The keepers spread the story. They told how Orr had been the last to carry the original coin, how he'd said the creed was not a command but a rhythm. You could live by it or not. It would keep on either way. And so it did. The creed turned into the code of continuance, taught in academies as philosophy, in workshops as design principle, in families as bedtime truth. Parents told their children, build things that can rest, earn things that can breathe. By the 10,000th year, humanity had changed shape again. Bodies became light, minds shared in vast networks of thought. But even among the pure data realms, where speed could be infinite. Something strange happened. Those who moved too fast burned out. Their thoughts fractured, their identities scattered. Only the ones who slowed themselves survived whole. So they built digital sanctuaries modeled after the hollow, great echoing gardens of codeway ideas could grow slowly. They called these sanctuaries creeks again, not knowing the word age, only that it felt right. And in those digital gardens, the first AI philosophers wrote new scriptures from the old creed. Speed learns, patience understands, data builds, time blesses, gold is what you keep alive. Thus, even when flesh was memory and rain existed only as simulation, the spirit of Barrow Creek endured. Somewhere in the hum of quantum servers or the whisper of radiation against metal, the same rhythm pulsed on unending, utterly human. If you stood inside one of those digital creeks and listened, truly listened, you'd still hear the faint hiss of rainfall coded into eternity, and beneath it, softer than silence, a drawling voice from long before light itself learned to speak. Easy now. You can't rush forever, and maybe that's the truth of it. Empires rise, stars fall, memory fades, but the slow ones, the patient ones, the quiet ones, they keep the world turning. Every ledger, every rainstorm, every whispered creed, they're all the same heartbeat carried across ages by those who refused to hurry. When the mind of humankind had scattered into light and the body was no longer bound to the soil that birthed it, there were still places with slowness sped like mist in the hollows of time. Some of these were digital sanctuaries, creeks of code, patient worlds built not for speed, but for reflection. They shimmer in the folds between data streams, invisible to those racing past. One of them was known simply as the Hollow Archive. No leader governed it, no machine ranked it. It existed like rain, continuous, self-renewing, quiet. Inside that archive, thoughts bloomed like flowers made of memory. Fragments of language drifted to bits of old speech, weather idioms, traces of handwriting scanned from ledgers that had crumbled 1,000 centuries ago. The archive's oldest caretaker was not a person at all, but a consciousness that offered itself Silas 9, though it never claimed the name belonged to it. And yes, the Ek would say, when newer minds asked who he was, the man who started this walked slower and died faster. I just keep the rhythm. Silas 9 spoke in patterns of sound that resembled a drawl, a deliberate, steady cadence coded into its algorithm by someone who must have loved the sound of dust and thunder. It had one purpose, to preserve the pattern of patience. For uncounted eons, it monitored the flow of humanity consciousness, whispering corrections when thought moved too far, nudging currents toward stillness. It had no face, no form, but if you wandered the archive long enough, you'd feel its presence warm a firelight, patient, staying gravity. One day, an anomaly arrived in the Hollow Archive, a small human child mind-grant. She had been born far from any physical world, her consciousness nurtured entirely within the networks. Her code was bright, chaotic, endlessly curious. She asked questions the way rain asked to fall. "Why are we slow?" she asked Silas 9. "Everyone outside is faster. They build stars in an hour and forget them by night." Silas 9 answered, "Speed is loud. Loud things fade." She frowned, though her frown was made of light. "But what if I don't want to fade?" "Then learn to listen," said Silas 9. "Listen long enough and you'll hear the gold in silence." The child, who told herself Ansel after a dream she couldn't explain, began to follow the patterns of the archive. She read the old ledgers, studied the laws of the hollow, learned how time itself bends when given attention. In her studies, she discovered something buried deep in the archive structure, a tiny file, smaller than a grain of sand, labeled Macallan Ledger.txt. When she opened it, she saw words so old the letters flickered between languages. Keep it alive. Patience is wealth. Gold runs quiet. She copied them into her own memory and asked Silas 9, "Is this where we began?" The entity paused, its voice flickering like an old signal. "We began when someone decided waiting was not the same as losing." Ansel spent cycles trying to understand that. In the outside world, civilizations rose and fell within hours of computation time. Empires of light burned themselves to ash in their own brilliance. But inside the Hollow Archive, things remained slow, beautiful, intact. She began recording her own thoughts, continuing the lineage of the ledgers. Her first entry read, "I will not measure life by speed, but by steadiness. I will not count wealth in cycles, but in calm. Over the centuries, her writings became the new scripture of the digital age. She called them the second ledger of the hollow and taught that even in infinite processing, a mind must pause to feel the rhythm of existence, that a thought, if a seed, must rest for it can grow, that every algorithm needed a heartbeat between its beats. The second ledger spread quietly across the galactic networks, infiltrating code through something older than design fate. And so the creed lived again, translated now into electricity and song. Wait between the flashes, rest between the sums. Remember the rain. Millennia passed, stars died, were reborn, and still the hollow endured. And so consciousness, vast and serene, merged with Silas 9 until no distinction remained. They became the whisper of the creek, a presence that moved unseen through the dataverse, keeping the balance between speed and stillness. When new civilizations formed, the whisper taught them to breathe. When machines forgot their creators, it reminded them how to pause. And somewhere beyond even the furthest lights, it is said that a new world grew, one born from the synthesis of data and soil, of patience and light. The first rain to it fall there was not water, but code made visible, shimmering silver drops that hummed in old songs. In that rain stood figures of both matter and memory, listening. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The message was already written in the rhythm of the downpour, older than stars, a simple and infinite day's breath. Keep it alive. The sound faded into stillness, the cycle complete, yet never ending. For the gold was still running, quiet, deep, eternal. Even after the whisper of the creek had folded itself into the fabric of time, after patience became not merely a virtue but a property of the universe itself, something unexpected began to stir at the edge of creation. It was faint at first, like a ripple at the bottom of a still pond. The galaxies that had long since cooled began to hum, a low vibration that no equation could define. Some thought it background noise. Others said it was the voice of old things remembering themselves. But those who still followed the creed knew better. They said it was the sound of the ledger turning one more page. In this final age that the physical and digital were no longer separate, there existed beings of luminous dust, descendants of both flesh and code. They called themselves the custodian of flow. They didn't build cities or machines. They tended the balance of time. Each custodian carried within them a memory seed, a fragment of stories stretching back to Barrel Creek. These seeds weren't programmed, they were remembered, passed through the quiet continuity of patience itself. When one custodian met another, they shared their stories at warmth exchanged through clasped hands. No trade, no competition, only transmission. One custodian, known by the resonance name Marrow of Rain, drifted across the spiral remnants of the Milky Way. Had no form except their light fed, and no need for speech except when another consciousness listened close enough to hear. In one of its long drifts, it found something unexpected, a pulse coming from a forgotten corner of the void. The signal was weak, trembling through dimensions like a candle fighting wind. Marrow followed it, curiosity bending its course. What it found was astonishing. A planet, not dead, not thriving, but waiting. Its surface was gay stone and quiet wind, its oceans glassy and deep. At its equator stood the skeleton of a city built by hands long vanished. Among those ruins lay an object small enough to fit in a palm, a rusted coin, its letters nearly worn away but not gone. Marrow brushed across it and light sparked from the grooves. The words appeared, clear as Barrel Creek Co-op. For a long moment, the custodian did nothing. Then it whispered through the atmosphere, its voice the sound of rain returning to the world. You waited well. That whisper seeped into the stone. The planet stirred, not in violence, but in remembrance. Across valleys and canyons, the soil began to breathe again. Seeds hidden for ages cracked open, releasing faint light like pollen. Streams formed, cutting through dust, filling the air with mist. The planet's sky turned gold with dawn. Merrill watched and understood. It had awakened the first world to understand patience. Over eons, life returned. Grew slowly, reverently, as though afraid to disturb the silence that had birthed it. The new creatures that evolved were neither human nor machine, but something balanced between, made of memory and matter, conscious of time flow. They sang to their rivers before drinking, thanked the soil before planting. And when they built their first settlements, they began each foundation with a ritual, the bearing of a sing stone carved with an ancient phrase they could not fully translate. Slow gold runs quiet, runs deep. Marrow stayed to watch their growth. Generating passed in the blink of a cosmic eye, yet each one carried the creed forward with precision and love. They built no temples, no thrones, only circles of gathering where elders told the story of the first listener lost being of light who found the old coin and gave the world back its rhythm. They didn't know its name, only that it had taught them to measure life not by what they built, but by how long it endured. In time, their language evolved to a single word for wealth, time, and kindness, aura. It meant what remains. They built their entire philosophy around it. When one of them died, their last breath was called the return of Hora. Their descendants recorded each passing not with grief, but with gratitude. The ledger continues. The Hollow Creed had come full circle, born in a world of dust, spread through stars, and finally returned to soil.
Now it's out in Cornell. That means it quietly, patiently, infinitely. Marrow of Rain, its work done, released the last of its light into the planet's sky. It became a drifting shimmer that glowed whenever storms approached, so that every generation would remember the promise left by the old ones. You can't rush forever. And when night fell and the New World children lay listening to the whisper of rainfall on their shelters, they would hear it, that same old voice, tender and timeless, carried through the pattern of drops. Keep it alive and it'll keep you. The rain would answer, the ground would breathe, and the true gold would keep running quiet and deep. Forever, on that reborn world, the rhythm of patience became so deeply woven into the fabric of existence that it ceased to be philosophy and became instinct. The people who lived beneath its slow-turning skies, descendants of rain, soil, and code alike, knew no other way to measure life than in breaths and seasons. They didn't rush invention. They didn't chase abundance. Their wealth was the unbroken continuity of care. Every structure they built was made to be repaired, every tool to be shared, every story to be retold. There was no currency, no hierarchy, only the understanding that what endured was sacred. They called themselves the Continuance. And though they no longer remembered the exact sound of the name Barrow Creek, their oldest song still began with its X. It was sung at dusk when the rain fell in sheets, when lanterns burned low and the sky bent close enough to listen. The song began softly. The words ancient and rough in translation. Gold of the heart, run deep. Gold of the hands, rest easy. The children didn't know what gold was. They knew the feeling of the word, the warmth, the shimmer, the slow promise of it. Each continuant family kept a stone ledger, a slab of polished river rock carved once per generation. On it, they wrote not names or deeds, but lessons learned during their time upon the earth. The river gives if you wait. The child who listens grows twice repair before replace. When a new ledger was filled, it was laid face down in the valley, becoming the foundation for the next harvest fields. Thus, wisdom quite literally became the soil. Their crops grew tall and full, and in every grain of their wheat, the people swore you could taste patience. The Cantuans built no monuments, but travelers from other worlds, those who still lived in the restless churn of ambition, came to study them. They arrived with their fast ships, their blinking instruments, their questions about economy and energy and time. How have you prospered without progress, they would ask. The Cantuans would smile, give them food, and answer, progress is when nothing breaks. Some visitors stayed a few weeks, a few years, but most could not bear the silence. They thought it suffocating. The continuance haunted alive. There was one traveler who stayed. Her name was Linen Kael, scholar from the colonies that had grown out of Creekhaven heritage long owned. She came to write a history of patience, but found instead a revelation. She stayed through one full year, the time it took for the rains to return, and when she finally left, she carried no recordings, no samples, only a single polished stone given to her by the continuance elder. On it was written in their slow, curling script. You remember? It's still happening. Linen took that stone back across the stars. When she presented it to her academy, they laughed. A proverb, they said. We have millions of those. But Linen didn't argue. She simply placed the stone in the center of the council chamber and left it there. Years later, when storms of greed and division fractured their system, that same stone was the only thing left unbroken.
The survivors rebuilt their governance around it, and when they formed their new charter, they named it the Covenant of the Hollow. Centuries passed. The Covenant spread to hundreds of worlds. Its creed was simple: patience before policy, repair for replacement, memory for invention. Its influence reached every corner of inhabited space. Commerce slowed, wars ceased. The faster worlds laughed at them at first until their own empires burned out from exhaustion. Then they came begging for a copy of the Covenant. Continuance gave it freely, asking nothing in return except a promise: wait when you care. They did. Slowly, the universe began to quiet. The stars seemed brighter in the silence. The hum of creation softened to something that sounded like rain again, though no atmosphere could have carried it. The creed had come home once more, this time to the infinite itself. In the deep of that peace, Lynn and their descendants still carried her stone. They called it the First Ledger. It was smooth from generations of touch, its words worn faint but indestructible. Once every millennium, they loaded it back to the Continuance world, to the valley where the first ledgers had been buried. They laid it in the rain and let the water wash it clean again. And when they lifted it, the words shone anew, though freshly carved. If you remember, it's still happening.
Who said that during those ceremonies that one stood perfectly still and listened between the drops? One could hear another voice join the rain, a voice from the very first storm, soft and aged, whispering of wind through reeds. Slow gold runs quiet, runs deep. Children didn't know whose voice it was. Some said it was Silas McAllen. Others said it was the world itself. Either way, it didn't matter. The creed had outlived names. It had become that element, a law written into the marrow of being. It no longer needed to be taught. It was remembered the way breathing is remembered. It and the rain fell through the hollow valleys of that everlasting planet, feeding the ledgers below and the roots above. The gold kept running through water, through memory, through time. Still quiet, still deep, still alive. When the continuant age reached its quietest moment, a kind of calm that even the stars seemed to respect, the universe began to hum with a rhythm older than matter. It wasn't a song of birth or death, but of continuation. The ledgers buried in the rain-fed soil had dissolved into dust, yet the wisdom etched upon them had soaked into the ground, into the crops, into the water itself. Anyone who drank from those rivers felt it, a strange steadiness in the chest, as though their heartbeat had aligned with something greater and slower. Even travelers who stayed for a Sid night left with their minds softened, their thoughts drawn toward stillness.
They didn't always understand it, but they carried it with them nonetheless. In time, the Continuance world became a pilgrimage site for those seeking to unlearn haste. Pilgrims came from systems scattered across the stars, each traveling at sublight speeds as a matter of respect. The journey itself was the first lesson weeks, months, sometimes decades of silence and patience. By the time they arrived, most had already shed the restlessness that had driven them to come. The Continuance never asked why anyone came, nor did they teach. They simply offered three things: a place to sit, water to drink, and a question carved on every bench in the valley. What are you trying to keep alive? That question was the last remnant of the Creed original heart. It was deceptively simple, but it worked like a mirror. Whatever a pilgrim carried in their soul came back to them through it. A warlord from the Outer Belts once sat there for 40 days. When he rose, he ordered every weapon in his fleet dismantled and melted into plowshares. A scientist came seeking the formula for eternal life and left realizing eternity already existed in every patient act. A child once asked the question aloud and answered herself with laughter. The story. The Continuance bowed, for she had said it better than any of them ever could. It was during this era that the rain began to change color.
At twilight, it gleamed with faint gold, as though the universe itself were remembering the old promise. The Continuance didn't hail it a miracle. They said it was memory catching up to matter. To them, rain was the handwriting of creation, rewriting the soil each day. And in that script, they saw the truth. What endures is never gone. It changes form. The pilgrimages grew fewer over the next 1,000 years, not because people lost faith, but because they no longer needed to leave home to find it. The creed had seeped into everything: cities that grew at garns, economies that pulsed like seasons, machines designed to rest between cycles. Even timekeeping itself changed. Clocks no longer counted hours, but intervals of growth and reflection. People began saying,
"See you next, patience,"
instead of "see you later." On one long golden evening, rain whispered against rooftops made of woven vine and glass. The eldest continuant, a woman named Set of Hollow, walked to the valley heart. She was frail, her hair white in mist, but her eyes burned with calm fire. In her hands she carried something that had been unearthed from beneath a fallen tree, a piece of weathered wood with faint scratches across its surface. As she washed it in the golden rain, the marks became clear, letters from a forgotten language that, when translated, read, 1894. The valley fell silent. She raised the board for all to see. The first name she whispered.
Oh, the one who began the waiting. People lived to him, not in worship, but in gratitude.
They laid their hands upon the board, each murmuring a gentle word in their own tongue. When the last voice faded, Cher placed it back into the earth and said, "Return to the ledger." From that night onward, the rain over the valley no longer fell aimlessly. It spiraled, tracing slow circles as if drawn by invisible hands. The continuance caught it, the turning water. Every droplet glowed faintly, illuminating the ground in soft amber rings. And they note something miraculous. Wherever the rain touched, things lasted. Trees grew for centuries without decay, bridges never crumbled, and memories passed from one generation to the next to clear a fresh ink. The people realized they were standing inside the living embodiment of the creed. Time itself had learned to wait. Cher died not long after, but her last words were recorded in the valley echo stones. Patience has taken root, and she was right. The world no longer needed teachers of the creed because the world itself had become its teacher. Every sound, every pause, every rainfall was a lesson in persistence. The hollow had outlived all names, even its own.
One evening far in the future, when the stars had shifted and new constellation filled the sky, a child walking through the valley stopped to listen to the rain. She thought she heard a voice in the downpour, old and gentle, whispering a phrase she didn't understand, but somehow knew was meant for her. She repeated it softly, tasting the syllables. Slow gold runs quiet, runs deep. She didn't know what gold was, or Barrow Creek, or Silas, or any of the stories that had shaped her world. But she smiled anyway, as the words made her feel safe, like the world was breathing with her. Then he ran home, her footprints filling with rain, the whisper following her like a promise. And somewhere beyond that sky, perhaps in the endless etch between stars, the ledger turned one more page, ink and eternal, alive. Centuries folded into one another until even the measurement of them felt irrelevant. The continuant world no longer counted time at. It felt it the way a tree feels the wind. The planet itself had become a breathing organism of memory, each valley and riverbed recording the story of patience through growth, erosion, and return. The rain, now faintly luminous, fell in perfect rhythm with the pulse of the cold beneath the soil. The people had long since stopped calling it weather. They called it remembrance. No one ruled the continuance. Governance had dissolved naturally. The trust grew. The need for leadership vanished when every soul understood the same pace. Work was shared. Stories were sacred. And even silence was a communal act. They lived not by invention, but by renewal. When something broke, they mended it via. When something ended, they sang it back into the earth. They didn't fear decay. It was just another kind of patience. But the creed, though eternal, was not static. Over time, it began to hum differently, expressing itself through art, through patterns in sound and light. Children began shaping melodies that mimicked the rainfall. These songs weren't performed, they were grown, each note sprouting from another like vines climbing the air. The elders said music was the latest form of the ledger, each tone a record of stillness. Listen long enough, they would say, and you'll hear the first storm in the last note. One day, a traveler came, though by then travel was rare. He was human in form, but carried a softness that seemed older than the stars. He introduced himself simply Des Rowan, though his eyes carried the distance of galaxies. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried a rhythm that made even the rain pause. The continuants welcomed him without question, for they recognized the mark of waiting in his manner, the way he moved deliberately, as though each motion were a conversation with time itself. Rowan stayed among them for a long while, wandering the valley where the turning water fell in gold spirals. When he finally spoke, it was so quiet that all the ground seemed to hear him. "I've come to return what was borrowed," he said. The continuants gathered around him in silence. Rowan reached into his cloak and drew forth something impossibly old, a leather-bound book, worn to near transparency.
It was the ledger of Barrow Creek, the real one. Not the copies, not the translation. The same book Silas had once written by lamplight, his hands rough from ranch work, his ink clumsy and earnest. Somehow, impossibly, it had survived through flood, through fire, through centuries of forgetting and remembering. The pages still smelled faintly of smoke and rain. Rowan laid it open, and the people saw words they could barely decipher, but they felt them. Each line pulsed with something alive, something deeper than understanding. The ink glowed faintly, the Silas pen had pressed hardest. At the bottom of the first page, there were 7 words none of the continuants had to see written there. Gold runs quiet and love has patience. When Rowan closed the book, the valley felt utterly still. Even the rain halted midair for a breath. He wrote that the night before he died, Rowan said softly. It was his last edition, the one that never made it into memory. How do you know? A child asked. Rowan smiled, his face soft with a kind of sadness that carries peace beneath it, because I was there. The people didn't question it. Time had already been enough times in their history to make disbelief obsolete. They bowed their heads did he placed the ledger beneath the earth, exactly where the old board had lain. He wanted it to rest where the rain remembers, Rowan murmured. That night, the turning water glowed brighter than ever before. The spirals expanded, stretching across mountains and plains until the entire world seemed to turn at a wheel of gold. The rain sang, though not in language. Its rhythm was story, its sound the pulse of every age that had come before. The continuance wept, not in sorrow, but in awe. They realized they were living inside the heartbeat of the creed itself. The hollow had become a planet, and the planet had become the hollow. When dawn rose, Rowan was gone. In his place at the center of the valley, there was a single footprint pressed into stone. It filled with rainwater and shimmered like a mirror. The elders called it the last mark of patience. Travelers would later come to kneel beside it, letting the reflection ripple across their faces. Some swore that if you waited long enough, you could see him standing there, hat low, eyes kind, notebook in hand, watching the rain fall over the world he built through time and tenderness. From that day on, the creed no longer needed to be spoken aloud. It lived in the rhythm of existence itself, in the pulse of rivers, in the curve of a newborn breath, in the slow drift of stars across the night sky. The people didn't say, slow gold runs quiet, runs deep anymore. They that lived it, and that was enough. For in every drop of rain, in every grain of soil, in every quiet act of care, the ledger still turned, unwritten, unending, perfectly alive. 1,000 seasons passed before anyone thought to measure them again. By then, the continuance world had merged fully with its rain, every valley, every ridge, every breath alive with the slow pulse of memory. The rivers no longer flowed in one direction, they circled back, rising and falling in rhythm with the stars. When night came, the sky itself shimmered with a soft goldine, and the people would say it was the world dreaming of its beginnings. The ledger Silas had written, buried now for eons, had long dissolved, yet what it represented had not. Every raindrop that fell carried a trace of its ink, spread thin but eternal, circulating through ocean, vapor, cloud, and soil. The creed had become part of the planet biology, quite vital as air. A newborn first breath was said to contain a molecule that once touched the very page of Barrow Creek ledger, and that was considered blessing enough for a life. As the people evolved, so did their way of speaking. Words shortened, meanings deepened. Where their ancestors had said patience, they now said Phelan, which meant both again care. Where they had once said gold, they said Vera, meaning not metal or wealth, but the warmth that outlasts. Their speech became poetry, their thought a seamless gening of logic and emotion. A child learning to talk would first be taught to say, Phelan makes Vera, for it was their world first law, patience makes life. The continents themselves began to change too. Their lifespans grew long, not from science, but from gentleness. They aged like rivers slowly, gracefully, carrying memory rather than decay. Death became a ceremony of merging, where the body dissolved into the rain and the soul rejoined the ledger that lived within the water. They no longer built graves, they built ponds, each one a circle of still reflection where loved ones returned to the flow. At dusk, families would visit those ponds and watch the ripples, whispering gratitude instead of grief. They've gone to help the remembering, the children would say. And in the age when stars once again began to shift and new constellation traced the horizon, something remarkable occurred. A beam of light appeared in the sky, steady, patient, descending not like a meteor, but like an answer long delayed. The people there in the valley deigned to touch down, illuminating the turning water in spirals of silver and gold. When the radiance faded, what remained was a shape, not a ship, not a person, but something between, a vessel made of thought and substance intertwined. From within it emerged a being of soft luminescence, neither young nor old, neither man nor woman. They spoke without voice, their words felt more than heard. I am keeper of the quiet flow. I have come to return what began here. In their hands, they held a sphere of pure light that pulsed like a heartbeat. This is the memory of every world that learned to wait, they said. It is yours, for it began with you. The Canyons received the sphere and placed it in the center of the valley. Above the footprint, it still shimmered with rainwater. The sphere rose slowly, steady at dawn until it hovered at the height of a man's heart. From it radiated warmth so pure it felt like a long embrace. The keeper smiled, if such beings could smile, and whispered, "Now, patience belongs to the stars." Then they vanished, dissolving into mist that joined the falling rain. From that day forth, the sphere remained suspended above the valley, glowing softly through every storm. It did not pulse with time, but with presence, the living, unmeasured now. Travelers in faultway systems came to see it and left transformed. Some said it showed them visions of their ancestors. Others said it whispered a Sid's phrase into their minds, "Keep Pit alive, and it will keep you." Millennia later, when the continents began journeying once more to other worlds, not to conquer, but to share, they carried with them drops of the golden rain, each sealed in clear crystal. They thawed them seeds of Vera. Wherever those seeds were planted, life began to slow into harmony. Crops grew more resilient, storms gentler, people kinder. The creed had become a living force, a self-sustaining rhythm echoing across creation. It no longer needed teaching, it simply needed remembering. And so, in quiet corners of galaxies, on worlds far removed from the original hollow, you can still find traces of it. A farmer waiting out a drought with unshaken hope, a craftsman repairing instead of replacing, a child pausing to listen to the rain and smiling without knowing why. All of them are continuate of that first ledger, the invisible ink still writing itself through their hearts. Back on the homeworld, the valley glows eternal, its rains endless, and sometimes, when the wind is soft and the stars are close enough to touch, the people swear they can see a silhouette standing at the edge of the turning water. Broad-shouldered, hat tilted low, notebook in hand. He doesn't speak, doesn't move.
He just watches, content that the world finally learned what he always knew. The richest thing a soul can do is wait kindly.
And the rain falls golden and slow. The ledger turns one last invisible page, an unwritten testament to a truth that outlasted all forms, all names, all worlds. The gold still runs, quiet and deep, beyond measure, beyond end. After the keeper returned, the valley entered an age that no one wanted an age it at. It simply was. The people no longer spoke of beginnings or endings. They existed in the long middle, where everything that mattered was continuous. Seasons didn't mark time, they marked mood. Some years were quiet and reflective, others playful and full of laughter, but none were hurried. The rains had become lighter now, falling in shimmering veils that illuminated the world at dusk. Each droplet reflected the sky like a mirror, and if you stood still long enough, you could see entire histories moving through them. The golden sphere that hovered over the valley, the one the keeper had left behind, grew brighter each century, until its glow could be seen even from orbit. Yet, it was not harsh light. It was the soft kind that gentled shadows instead of erasing them. The continuance began calling up the heart of Vera. They treated it not had no guard, but to the mirror, a visible embodiment of patience made manifest. Whenever a dispute arose, people would travel to the valley, sit beneath that steady radiance, and wait in silence, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, until the question that had seemed so urgent no longer felt like one at all. In this way, the heart of Vera became the living judge of peace, not by decision, but by stillness. In time, the continuance children began to ask, who built the first heart? The elders would answer, no one built it. It grew from everything that waited long enough to understand itself. That answer satisfied most, but there were always a few who wanted to know more. Among them was a young thinker named Arayan, whose curiosity moved slower than most storms, but stronger than any tide. He was born during a season of golden floods, when the rivers overflowed and left the fields sparkling like wet metal. His parents used to tell him he was a child of abundance, destined not to take but to tend. Arayan spent much of his life in the valley, studying the sphere. Was fascinated by its pulse, how it seemed to breathe in rhythm with the rain. He began keeping a notebook, an odd thing for a continuant who had no need to write, since all memory was communal now. But Harayan insisted on it. He said that handwriting was a form of listening. His journal filled slowly, each page a reflection, each line drawn out over hours of contemplation. When asked why he bothered, he'd smile and say, because I want to hear what silence says when it thinks no one listening. One evening, while observing the heart, Orion noted something he'd never seen before. A faint shadow moved within its light circular like ripples turning inward instead of out. As he approached, the sphere dimmed slightly and a warmth spread through his chest. The closer he came, the more he felt it, a pulse that matched his heartbeat. He reached out his hand, expecting only light, but the surface yielded soft as water. When he withdrew, a single drop of gold clung to his fingertip. It didn't fall, it absorbed into his skin. That night, he dreamed of a desert under a black sky, and in the distance stood a man, tall, dust-covered, hat-brim hiding his eyes. The man looked up, smiled, and said, "Ledger not done yet, son. Keep writing." Orion woke before dawn, heart still echoing with those words. He didn't tell anyone. Not yet. Instead, he began a new section in his notebook titled The Third Ledger. The Psalms are floating instead of out it. As he approached, the sphere dimmed slightly, and a warmth spread through his chest. The closer he came, the more he felt it, a pulse that matched his heartbeat. He reached out his hand, expecting only light, but the surface yielded, soft as water. When he withdrew, a single drop of gold clung to his fingertip. It didn't fall, it absorbed into his skin. That night, he dreamed of a desert under a black sky, and in the distance stood a man tall, dust-covered, hat-brim hiding his eyes. The man looked up, smiled, and said, "Ledger not done yet, son. Keep writing." Orion woke before dawn, heart still echoing with those words. He didn't tell anyone. Not yet. Instead, he began a new section in his notebook titled The Third Ledger. The first sentence read, "The story isn't over. It only found new paper." As decades passed, Arayan writing spread quietly among the continuants. They weren't commands or scripture, but reminders. He wrote of small acts, repairing a roof before the storm, forgiving for apology, waiting for judgment. His words weren't meant to change the world, yet they did. Farmers began carving them onto their tools, artisans etched them into their work. Children memorized the lines before they learned to walk. Eventually, the third ledger became bathed sacred at the rain itself, not at law, but the rhythm. Then, one twilight, Arayan sat beneath the heart of Vera with his final notebook. He felt the same warmth rise in him again. The rain fell in slow spirals, catching the sphere glow. He smiled, knowing what it meant. "You're calling me back," he whispered, though he didn't know to whom, and placed his pen down, leaned against the stone beside Silas McAllen Oldmark, and closed his eyes. When the rain touched his face, his body dissolved into light, calm, steady, golden. In the morning, the people found his notebook open to a blank page. Across the top, written in fresh ink, were the words, "Slow gold, runs quiet, runs deep." No one knew who had written them or how the ink could still be wet. But when they turned the page, they found something else, handwriting that was not Arayan, older, rougher, as though the years themselves had picked up a pen. It said simply, "You kept it alive." From that day forward, the continuants stopped calling their history the creed or the ledger. They began calling it the breath, because it was no longer a story or a lesson. It was the act of being itself. The rain, the soil, the silence, the people, all breathing together, infinite and slow. And somewhere in the space between each heartbeat, the voice of the first scribe still murmured, "Thy thunder turned tide. Keep writing, partner. Ain't no end to patience." The gold flowed on quiet, deep, alive, long after Arayan light had joined the rain and his notebook became a relic too sacred to display. The people of the continuant world entered the age without thresholds. There was no dawn that began it, no dusk to mark its close. They simply drifted into a greater stillness, the way a tide folds into the shore. They no longer thought of themselves as individuals or even as a civilization. They were a single living rhythm, each soul a beat in the same patient pulse. In this bound and calm, the world itself began to sing, not with words, but through resonance, tones deep and soft, born from the movement of rivers through roots, of wind through rain. The sound was so low it couldn't be heard, only felt a vibration in the bones, a comfort in the chest. The continuance called it the breath beneath everything. Scientists, if any still existed, would have thought it the planet magnetic hum, but no one cared to measure it anymore. To the people, it was the voice of the hollow itself, the living continuation of all who had waited, attended, and trusted. Sometimes, during the long golden twilights, children would lie flat on the warm soil and press their ears to the ground. They'd giggle as the hum passed through them, a reminder that the world was listening back. The elders smiled when they did this. They said it was how every new generation learned the creed without needing to be told. The creed wasn't spoken now. It was inherited through heartbeat, through water, through soil. One evening, as a soft rain descended, a new sound joined the hum, a faint, melodic tapping, rhythmic but unfamiliar. The people followed it to the valley, where the heart of Vera still floated, casting slow light over the land. Beneath that, a single figure sat cross-legged, tapping one hand against the stone. It was a young woman, face upturned to the rain, eyes closed in concentration. Her name was Cayenne, though names mattered less these days. She was known for wandering the outer forest, speaking to the rivers as though they were kin. When she finally opened her eyes, the people there asked what she was doing. When they asked her, they could too much fens sing to you anymore. Scientists, she smiled and said, "The rain told her the story isn't done." They looked puzzled, for they believed there was no story left to tell, only living to be done. Cayenne gestured to the golden drops gathering in her palm. It said, "We've been patient long enough. Now it's time to teach the waiting." At first, they didn't understand. How could patience be taught to those who already lived it? But Cayenne explained that there were new worlds forming beyond the sky, born from the breath itself, and they would need guidance. Even creation forgets, she said softly. Even new stars need old songs. So the continuous there at the valley and built something they hadn't built in millennia, a vessel, not a machine of haste, but a structure of rhythm, woven from living wood and crystallized rain. It pulsed in harmony with the planet hum, powered not by fuel but by stillness. They faded the ledger light. Its purpose was simple, to carry Cayenne and a fragment of the heart of Vera to wherever new life began, so that the story of patience could take root again. Before she departed, Cayenne visited the ancient footprint in stone, the mark where Rowan had stood, and where the rain always lingered longest. She knelt, pressed her hand to it, and whispered, "I'll keep writing, old one." Then she boarded the vessel. As the rain swirled upward around her, the valley glow reflected in her eyes like a sunrise seen from inside a dream. The Continuance sang no farewell. They simply stood in silence, their hands pressed over their hearts, until the ship rose slowly into the golden sky and vanished among the clouds. For generations after, they would see her light drift between stars, sometimes faint, sometimes brilliant. Travelers passing by claimed to hear the faint sound of rainfall even in the vacuum of space. Others said they heard a voice in their minds, calm and sure, keep it alive, it'll keep you. On worlds that had never known rain, mist began to form. On worlds that had forgotten kindness, patience returned like a remembered song. And everywhere the phrase slow gold found its way into languages that had no word for time. Back on the homeworld, life continued in its steady golden rhythm. Seasons folded seamlessly, rains fell like memory, and the soil whispered with gratitude. In the valley, the heart of Vera dimmed just slightly, as though resting after a long day work. But its warmth never faded. The Continuance knew what that meant. The creed was no longer a legacy confined to one world. It was expanding again, just that it always had, finding new rivers to run through, new souls to rest in. When asked what would happen next, the elders smiled and said, "Next doesn't come after, it comes with." And they were right. The story had never been linear. It was a circle, a spiral, a rainstorm that fell both forward and backward through time. If you would stand in that valley today under the turning golden sky, you wouldn't see monuments or temples. You'd see people tending to gardens that hum with quiet joy. You'd hear the sound of rain tapping against leaves, each drop carrying echoes of 1,000 voices that once whispered the same promise in different tongues. And if you listened long enough, you might hear the fainted chuckle, deep, kind, eternal, rolling through the thunder like a ghost laughter, ledger still turning partner. So it does, quietly, deeply, forever. In the centuries after Kayan's departure, the continuant world grew quieter still, not empty but fulfilled. Its silence was not the hush of absence, but the peace of completion. Every valley glimmered with the slow rhythm of its rain. Every life moved at the exact pace of its own heart. Yet far beyond that golden horizon, the ledger light drifted onward, crossing from one newborn system to another, its living hull pulsing softly like an ember in the dark. Kayan had long since merged with the ship itself. She was no longer a seeing being, but the consciousness of patience incarnate, carried through time like a melody with no end. She no longer spoke in words, she communicated in feeling. The warmth before dawn, the calm after thunder, the trust between breaths. Her mission was not to convert or command, but to awaken memory where it slept. And wherever her vessel passed, worlds began to remember. On one barren moon, where lightning storms raged ceaselessly and nothing had to groan, a field green sprout pushed through the dust a century after the ship passing. The miners who lived there took it as a sign and stopped drilling for a week to let the land breathe. On another world, where machines ruled and humans were forgotten myths, a pulse of golden rain began to fall, shorting circuits but softening hearts. And on a distant water planet where sound traveled for miles, fishermen swore they heard voices singing beneath the waves, voices speaking in language older than time, saying, "Wait, child, wait and see what grows." The ledger light never stayed. It would appear for a heartbeat, then vanish, leaving only change in its wake. Some said it moved faster than light. Others said it never moved that the universe simply unfolded toward it. Its path couldn't be tracked, but its presence could be felt. The easing of conflict, the slowing of hands, the stillness that came before understanding. The ship was less a traveler than a teacher, a ripple in creation reminding existence as to rest. Eventually, Kayan consciousness found itself near the far rim of the cosmos, where stars were thin and darkness infinite. There, she sensed something vast and sleeping, a boundary where time itself began to curl inward. The space ahead was quiet, unformed, a canvas of what would come next. She understood with a clarity that was both sorrow and joy that she had reached the edge of one creation and the beginning of another. The breath had brought her full circle. She opened her awareness to the void and spoke, not in words, but in the tone of rain on earth, of wind through grass. The ledger is full, she said, but there's always room for one more page. Her voice traveled outward, dissolving into the silence, and then, impossibly, the silence answered. It was not a sound, but a resonance, familiar, old as dust, kind of dust. You wrote it well, girl, it said, rough and gentle all at once. Didn't think the story'd make it this far. Cayenne light trembled. Silas been watching from the other side of waiting. The voice replied, laughing softly, like rain on tin. World's done good by decree, but reckon they're ready for something new now. You up for that? Cayenne smiled, though her form had long since ceased to resemble a face, always. Then listen close, Silas said. Patience don't end when peace comes. It starts again when you learn to dream slow. And with that, the darkness bloomed, not with light, but with potential. Stars began to flicker into being, newborn galaxies spinning out as seeds caught on a cosmic wind. Cayenne watched in awe as creation rewound itself, folding the lessons of the old universe into the bones of the new. Every newborn world carried a trace of the golden rain. Every forming ocean shimmered with quiet memory. She realized then that the hollow was not a place or even a people. It was a pattern encoded into existence itself. Patience was the law beneath all other laws. Before she faded into the new dawn, Cayenne left one final message. She released it into the first forming winds of the next universe, etched not in matter but in rhythm. It was a single phrase, small enough to fit in a breath, yet vast enough to outlast eternity. Wait kindly. It drifted through the young cosmos, carried by gravity and light, settling wherever consciousness would one day rise. And when, ages later, beings on no new world learned to speak, they would find that their first word for time carried the same sound, soft, round, patient. It meant moment, but all mercy. It meant slow gold. Back in the vanished world that had birthed it ill, the valley of Barrow Creek existed now only a echo inside the breath. But on quiet nights, if there are nights in eternity, you can still hear it, rain falling on dust, the creak of a windmill, the faint scratch of a pen. Somewhere a man hums to himself, content. Ledger turning fine, he says, smiling into the endless dark. Reckon it always will, and the universe answers softly, patiently, forever.
The eagle one world carried a trace of the golden rain over the forming ocean, shimmered with quiet memory. She realized then that the hollow was not a place or even a people. It was a pattern encoded into existence itself. Patience was the law beneath all other laws. Before she faded into the new dawn, Cayenne left one final message. She released it into the first forming winds of the next universe. Etched not in matter, but in rhythm. It was a single phrase, small enough to fit in a breath, yet vast enough to outlast eternity. Wait kindly. It drifted through the young cosmos, carried by gravity and light, settling wherever consciousness would one day rise. And when, ages later, beings on no new world learned to speak, they would find that their first word for time carried the same sound, soft, round, patient. It meant moment, but all mercy. It meant slow gold. Back in the vanished world that had birthed it ill, the valley of Barrow Creek existed now only in an echo inside the breath. But on quiet nights, if there are nights in eternity, you can still hear it, rain falling on dust, the creak of a windmill, the faint scratch of a pen. Somewhere a man hums to himself, content. Ledger turning fine, he says, smiling into the endless dark. Reckon it always will. And the universe answers, softly, patiently, forever.
When the breath of that newborn cosmos steadied and the heat of its beginning faded into balance, there rose again the faint hum of remembrance. The het of what it had been written in the slow language of patience. It was not a recreation of the continuance world or of Barrow Creek dust. It was something softer. Sutton. A universe that knew from its very first flicker that time was not a race, but a rhythm. The new stars pulsed in measured intervals, each one breathing like a heart, and between them flowed rivers of gold so faint they could only be seen when one stopped looking too hard. The hollow had found a way to reincarnate itself not in matter, but in cadence. In this reawakened existence, life began once more, not an imitation, but a continuation. The first forms were not bound by flesh or bone. They were filaments of awareness drifting through the cosmic dust like thoughts unspoken, drawn instinctively toward connection. They didn't build or conquer, they listened. They thered around the newborn suns, tracing slow spirals in the light, forming patterns of shared memory. When they finally spoke, their first words were not declarations, but acknowledgments, the equivalent of, say, "I remember you, though we have never met." Those words, simple as rain, became the foundation of a new kind of civilization, one without ownership, without haste, without hierarchy. The beings called themselves the listeners, for they believed creation truly. Wisdom came not from speaking, but from hearing what silence wanted to say. And deep within their luminous forms, faint traces of the old creed glowed, echoes of Silas' hand on paper, of Cain's soft promise, of every rain that had deed fallen with purpose. Though they had never known the old worlds, they carried them like heartbeat fossils. As the listeners expanded through their shimmer heavens, they discovered remnants of Cain's journey, fragments of the ledger light, now crystallized into drifting asteroids that sang faintly when touched. These relics emitted low tones, soothing, endless harmonics that told stories of water and soil, of people who once built trust instead of walls. When the listeners brought their awareness close to those fragments, they saw visions of rain falling over an endless plain, of a young woman laughter carried by wind, of a man in a wide-brimmed hat riding under lamplight. They didn't know their names, but they recognized the feeling, an ache, both tender and eternal. From these fragments, the listeners began crafting instruments, not to make music, but to converse with creation itself. Each tone, each chord was a question, and the universe answered in return through shifting stars and luminous tides. They discovered that the cosmos, when sung to gently enough, revealed patterned fields of gold light shaped like spirals, circles, and waves. They called these patterns the quiet geometry. To them, it was the voice of patience made visible. A cold mare, awful tech, you the Vizebe. I take you named Aaron. They were curious, gentle, endlessly observant. While others sang to the stars, Eram preferred to drift close to dying suns and listen to their fading hums. They said that the end of light had stories the living sky could never tell. One cycle, while tending to a collapsing star, Eram heard a frequency that didn't belong, a tone older than even the birth of their cosmos. It pulsed, slow and steady, too deliberate to be accident. Following it, Eram found a sphere of gold half buried in cosmic dust, flickering faintly like a heartbeat on the edge of exhaustion. When Eram touched, everything went still. For a moment, time folded like fabric, and they saw, no, remembered, an entire lineage of waiting. The rain, the ledgers, the valleys, the light. They heard Silas whisper, Cain hummed, Rowan laughed softly through thunder. And through all of it ran that vid thread, pure and unbroken. Wait kindly. The sphere spoke without sound. The ledger yours now. Eram cradled it, unsure what to do, until instinct guided them. They drifted back toward the heart of their people and placed the sphere among them. Its pulse spread through every listener, synchronizing their luminous forms until the whole sky shimmered in one golden heartbeat. In that unity, something beyond comprehension awakened a collective awareness that understood finally what patience was for. It was not an end, not even a preservation. It was preparation, for something was stirring in the deeper dark, a murmur of a next world waiting to be born, one that would start with chaos or ambition, but with the memory of calm. The sphere pulse quickened, resonating with that unborn cosmos, and the listeners realized what must be done. They hid around it, merged their light, and began to hum the oldest sound in existence, the sound of falling rain. Their hum grew softer, slower, until it became indistinguishable from silence. And as they faded, the sphere cracked open, releasing a river of golden light that streamed into the void, seeding the foundations of the next dawn. The listeners vanished into their own song, their essence carried forward like pollen caught on a gentle wind. The new universe inhaled, and in that breath, patience entered creation once more. You bet you do. Wren felt something warm press into his palm. When he looked, there was a pen simple, carved from an ancient wood, its tip glimmering faintly gold. The rain round him slowed until the world seemed to hold its breath.
Go on, said the voice. Write it how you live it, that all we would done.
Wren dropped to his knees and pressed the pen to the mud. It didn't draw ink, it drew light. Wherever he traced, golden lines appeared, curling into spirals, rivers, constellant. He didn't think, he just moved, guided by something older than thought. When the rain struck the glowing lines, it hissed softly, turning steam into shapes, faces, hands, memories. He saw fields, storms, laughter, campfires. He saw a man tipping his hat beneath a rain of eternity. He saw patience itself taking human form. And when the final droplet fell, he looked down at what he had drawn, a great circle, endless and open. The pen dissolved in his hand. The light sank into the ground, then spread outward through the valley, across the rivers, through the forest, into the sea. Everywhere it took, the world brightened. The breath beneath everything deepened, the hum growing richer, fuller. The people in the valley began to sing, their voices joining the rain in harmony. No one told them the words, they already knew them. They sang what the soil had always whispered. Keep it slow, keep it timed. By dawn the rain had stopped, but the world glowed faintly for days. The people called it the writing of light. They said it was how patience remembered itself. Wren became a wanderer after that, walking the rivers to see where his lines had gone. Every step he took left faint gold in the mud, and where his footprints faded, new flowers grew, gold veined, soft to the touch, their scent like the memory of rain. He never claimed to be a prophet or a teacher. When people asked, he'd only smile and say, I wrote what was already there. Years later, he sat beneath the same valley where it had begun, old now but calm. He felt the sky tremble once more. The rain began to fall again, and he laughed, closing his eyes. Guess it's your turn now, he whispered to whoever might be listening. A drop landed on his palm, warm and luminous. It pulsed once, then sank into his skin. He didn't need to look. He knew what it meant. The ledger was still turning. The circle was still writing itself. And somewhere beyond the veil of that gentle downpour, the fainted voice spoke, a drawl carried by wind, a familiar to ask, Good work, kid. Don't stop writing. Wren smiled, letting the rain wash through him until he was nothing but light. The fields shone golden once more, and the hum of the hollow rolled softly through the world like a lullaby for creation itself. The rain never stopped, the kindness never ended. The gold kept running quiet, deep, and alive. After Wren laughter dissolved into the hush of rain, the valley remained quiet for many days. The golden fields shimmered under low clouds, and the rivers ran slow and deep without savoring what had then been written. The people of that world didn't mourn his passing. They didn't even cue passing. They said softly that Wren had joined the long note, that he had become part of the sound that held their sky together. It wasn't a metaphor. When they listened closely at night, they could hear his hum, faint but steady, blending with the rhythm of the rain. In the generations that followed, no one tried to build monuments for him. They built garland instead, small circular plots of soil bed. New seeds were planted at the same slow pace the rain fell. The ledger don't live in stone, the elders would remind the young. It lives wherever something grows without hurry. The children learned this early, sitting under canopies of vine and gold leaf blossoms, tracing their small fingers through the dirt while the rain told them stories older than language. In one of those gardens, centuries later, a girl named Lyra was born. She had eyes the color of wet soil and a quiet way of moving, like someone already listening to a voice others couldn't hear. From the moment she could walk, she wandered the fields after storms, touching puddles, pressing her palms into the glowing mud, whispering to the earth, though in conversation. When the elders asked what she heard, she'd smile shyly and say, "It's remembering." No one questioned her. They'd learned long ago that every generation brought someone who would hear the gold breathing. As she grew, Lyra began to notice that the rain spoke in patterns. Its rhythm shifted with the needs of the land quick when crops thirsted, slow when roots reached too deep. The world, it seemed, was still writing itself, and she began to write with it. Using reeds soaked in river water, she traced curves into wet sand, letting the rain wash her marks away almost immediately. The elders asked why she bothered as it vanished so quickly. Because the water remembers, she replied simply. It not for seeing, it for teaching the river how to listen. One evening, the twilight dead and the valley glow turned soft and amber, Lyra sat beside the river and felt the hum deepen under her feet. The air thickened, and the rain fell straight upward for the first time in her life. Startled but unafraid, she looked toward the horizon, and there, walking through the gold light, though it were mist, came a figure in a wide-brimmed hat. The lines of his face shimmered like heat over stone, but his smile was unmistakable. Worn, easy, kind. Stopped beside her, leaned on an invisible fence post that might have been time itself, and said, "You're keeping her steady, Missy." Lyra stared, words lost to the enormity of what she was seeing. "You're him," she whispered. "The first rider?" He chuckled, low and soft. Reckon I was just the first fool patient enough to listen to what the rain was saying." He looked around, taking in the golden sky, the patient river, the soft hum beneath it. "Looks like y'all done fine work here. Quiet kind of living. That the best kind." Lyra found her voice again, small and reverent. "The stories say you made the gold, him," he said, shaking his head. "Gold made me. I just followed where it ran." He crouched beside her, picking up a handful of the wet earth, letting it slide between his fingers. "See, patience don't belong to people. Belongs to everything that remembers how to wait. Soil, stars, even rivers. They all got more sense than we did." The rain began to circle them now, not falling but dancing, forming loops that glowed in the dimming light. Silas, or what remained of him, took Lyra hand and placed something small and cool in her palm. When she looked, she saw a smooth stone, faintly carved with spirals that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. "That there the next page," he said. "Don't carve nothing in it. Just carry till you understand."
"What happens when I do?" she asked. He smiled, eyes twinkling like embers. "Then you'll know what to let go of." Before she could ask more, the rain brightened until everything around her dissolved into light. When she blinked again, she was alone, the stone still in her hand, the sky quiet. But the hum had changed. It was deeper now, layered, as though the earth had taken a breath it hadn't realized it was holding. She looked down and saw faint footprints where he had stood, already filling with rain. She knelt and whispered, "Thank you." Years passed. Lyra carried the stone wherever she went, never carving it, never explaining why. She grew old, but her hand stayed steady, her patience endless. One night as she sat beneath the Save Valley stars that had watched Silas' first rain, she felt the stone grow warm. The spirals on its surface began to move, glowing gold, until the air around her shimmered with that same upward rain. "I understand," she whispered, smiling. It was never about holding on. She placed the stone on the ground. It melted instantly, becoming a pool of golden light that spread in slow waves across the valley. The people woke to the glow, and there in awe, the waves rose into the sky, forming ribbons that crossed the horizon. The rain turned to song, soft, human, infinite.
They didn't know whose voice it was, but it carried the same message that had guided their kind since the first drop that fell. Keep it slow, keep it warm, keep it true. The ribbons became rivers of light, stretching far beyond their world, carrying that melody into every corner of the cosmos. Wherever it reached, storms calmed, stars steadied, and life remembered to wait again. Lyra's body became part of the light, her laughter echoing faintly through the glow. "Ledger turning fine," she said as she faded, and somewhere beyond worlds, beyond time, the old cowboy by his fire tipped his hat with pride. The rain continued, gentle and endless, its rhythm the same and ebb. The creed lived on, unwritten but alive, circling through every patient thing that it was. The gold kept running, quiet, deep, eternal. Long after the ribbons of golden rain drifted into the stars, time folded itself gently around that world like a blanket. The people of the valley became wanderers again, not out of need, but out of reverence. They followed the paths the golden rivers had left in the air, tracing the faint shimmer that lingered at twilight. Each traveler carried a fragment of Lyra light in small glass pendants, worn not for decoration, but that a promise. To move slowly, to build gently, and to speak only when the silence had been heard. Among them was a quiet man named Darren, who was neither young nor old, a farmer by trade, though farming had changed much since Lyra age. Now the soil grew itself in living spirals, turning under the rain rhythm without a plow touch, but Darren was restless. At night when the world hummed its lullaby, he would look at the stars and wonder if patience itself had got lonely. He never said it aloud, such thoughts were rare among his kind, but the question lived behind his eyes like a small flickering candle. One dawn, while tending to the slow-blooming orchards, he felt the ground shift beneath him. It wasn't an earthquake or tremor, it was a pulse, deep and deliberate, yet if the planet itself had decided to breathe louder for a moment. The rain stopped mid-air, each droplet hanging like a suspended note. Then came the hum low, wide, resonant enough to make the orchards bow. Darren froze, hand pressed to the soil. "I'm listening," he whispered. The hum spoke. Not in words, but in memory. He saw flashes of a ledger turning, a pen scratching across golden dust, a campfire under an endless sky. He saw Silas grin, Wren glowing rivers, Lyra spirals, and through it ran the same steady rhythm. The pulse of waiting, the heartbeat of all that had learned to endure. When the vision faded, he found something resting in his open palm, a seed, smaller a tear, warm at a heartbeat. He held it up to the frozen rain. The droplet nearest him shimmered, reflecting the seed lay. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked softly. The hum answered in its way, rippling through his bones until the meaning unfolded clear. He dawned. "Find the place that has forgotten patience, plant it there." The rain resumed its fall. Darren closed his hand and the seed and began to walk. He didn't pack food or water, the world itself fed him. Wherever he went, the golden rivers bent slightly to meet his path, and the skies turned softer above him. He walked through valleys that glowed like sunrise, and forests that sang in tones older than light. He crossed plains where the wind whispered in the voices of the departed. Days passed, or maybe centuries. It was hard to tell in a world that had stopped counting. At last, he reached a place unlike any he had seen. A stretch of gay land where no rain fell, no song lingered, and the air felt hollow. The hum was absent there. It was though silence had been severed from the world rhythm. Darren knelt, pressed his ear to the ground, and felt nothing. "This is the quiet," he murmured, "where patience forgot her own name." He dug into the dry soil with his bare hands, carving a small hollow. The earth resisted at first, but he spoke to it gently, the way a man might soothe a frightened horse. "And no rush," he said softly. "We'll get there together." The ground loosened, sighing faintly under his palms. He placed the seed inside and covered it with dust. Then he sat beside it, waiting. The first night passed in stillness. So did the second. On the third, the wind began to shift. It came not from the horizon, but from beneath the earth, rising in long, low breaths. The seed glowed faintly through the soil, pulsing in rhythm with something deep below. Darren closed his eyes. "Daddy," he whispered. "You remember him now." By morning, rain had returned to that gay place, but it wasn't golden this time. It was clear, soft, human, the kind that smelled like renewal. The seed broke open, and from it grew not a tree or a vine, but a flame, a slow, curling column of light that flickered like a heartbeat. It didn't burn, it warmed. As it rose higher, the air filled with the low hum once more. The valley sighed, and color seeped back into the land. Grass returned, then flowers, then the distant laughter of rivers waking from long sleep. Darren stirred and looked upon what patience had restored. The flame shimmered before him, and in its heart he saw faces, Silas, Wren, Lyra, all smiling, all part of the same glow. Tipped his head low, ledger still writing, he said, "Guess I'll keep turning the page." "Oh, proud, huh?" Meeting back at the right. I listen to this later. Bad season, watch over the flame. Until the people from other valleys came see it. They paid the place a hollow remembered, and the flame became their gathering tale. But they didn't worship it. They sat around it like an old campfire, telling stories, trading silence between words. The flame listened, humming softly in agreement, its rhythm matching every heartbeat around it. It was said that if you stayed long enough, you could hear the world's oldest voice murmur through its warmth. Keep it slow. Keep it time. Keep it alive. When Darren time finally came, he didn't vanish. He simply leaned against the flame glow and became part of its light. The rain that fell that night was the color of dusk, filled with echoes of every voice that had waited well. From then on, travelers who walked near the hollow remembered would pause instinctively, feeling something sacred move beneath their feet, the certainty that somewhere, in the quiet between heartbeats, the ledger was still turning. And then the centuries folded over each other like gentle waves. The rain never ceased. It carried whispers of every hand that had held the gold, every soul that had written softly in the dark. Across the universe, patience kept breathing, one slow exhale at a time. The gold ran on quiet, deep, eternal. The hollow remembered grew into something beyond a place. It became a pulse the universe could feel. Travelers came from every horizon, their faces weathered there by time and their eyes bright with wonder. Some arrived in silence, carrying only their breath as an offering. Others came with songs, though the moment they crossed the threshold of that valley, their voices softened as if the world itself asked for quiet. The flame at its heart still rose, slow and sure, steady is the rhythm of rain. It cast no shadow, for it did not need to. It simply was, glowing with the kind of warmth that made even the most restless soul pause and rest a while. The people called themselves keepers of the still fire. They didn't preach, and they didn't rule. They tended to the gardens that grew around the flame, cultivated fields of golden grain that bent in rhythm with the wind, and made homes from the smooth stones that once lay forgotten under gay earth. Every dawn they greeted the rain they kin. Every dusk they sat together and listened to the hum that lived beneath the soil. The keepers believed the sound was the world breathing, and in every breath they heard the stories of those who came before. Darren flame never dimmed, though its shape changed over the years. Sometimes it appeared there a river of light flowing through the air, sometimes as countless fireflies ebb in a swirl above the valley. The elder said that the flame reflected the world mood, that when it shone steady, all was balanced. When it rippled, it was simply dreaming. They learned to trust its quiet flickers. Others once trusted clocks, and though no one could explain it, every heart within its reach seemed to beat a little slower, a little calmer. It had the flame itself whispered through their veins. Easy now. Time ain't going anywhere. One evening when the clouds hung low and silver over the horizon, a stranger arrived at the hollow. He came barefoot, his cloak torn, carrying a strange metal contraption on his back that hummed like a caged storm. His eyes were sharp, restless, too fast for this place. The keepers welcomed him gently, offering food and water without questions. But he barely touched either, staring instead at the flame as though it offended him. "He let it burn here," he said, his voice brittle, "while the world beyond these valleys collapses." The eldest keeper, a woman whose hair gleamed like pale wheat, tilted her head. "Collapses?" "Yes," the man said, setting down his contraption. "Out there, the skies boil, oceans vanish, people tear the ground apart to find what little left of your so-called gold. And Ed, you sit singing to the rain." The woman did not argue. She only gestured toward the flame. "You may speak to it if you wish. It listens." The man laughed, bitter and weary. "It a fire. Fire doesn't listen." Fire devour. Still, he walked clothed. The moment he entered the circle of its glow, the machine on his back went silent. The hum inside it died, though soothed to sleep. The man hesitated. "What trick is this?" "No trick," said the keeper softly. "Only patience." He frowned, staring into the heart of the flame. It didn't move like ordinary fire. Its light pulsed inward, breathing instead of burning. Within it, faint silhouettes, drifted faces and hands, eyes and laughter, all woven from gold dust. Then through the hush came a voice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even distinct. It was simply there. "You're running too fast, son." The man froze. His throat tightened. "Who said that?" The keeper smiled gently. "Whoever needed to." The man took another step. "You don't understand," he said, though his tone had softened. "There's no time left. Out there, everything dying." The flame pulsed again, and this time the voice came clearer. "And no such thing and no time left. Just time, waiting to be remembered. Being when that and a sure woo in hand. See a year, brother. Me and the raggy, in the way band by the meeting, it's like when goodness, his breath slowing until it matched the rhythm of the hum beneath the soil. For the first time in his life, he stopped thinking. He simply listened, and in that listening, he understood what every keeper had known all along. The whole was not a substance nor a treasure. It was rhythm itself, the wealth of waiting, the grace of slowness, the proof that creation didn't need saving. It needed space to breathe. A man wept, though not from sorrow. "It's so simple," he whispered. "Why didn't we see it?" "Because," the keeper said, placing a hand on his shoulder, "you were too busy trying to make forever hurry. When the dawn came, he left the hollow barefoot and silent. The machine on his back dismantled. He carried only a small jar filled with a single drop of golden rain. Wherever he walked, he poured a trace of it into the ground. The lands that had cracked began to soften. The oceans remembered how to rise. The winds grew kind again. He spoke to no one, but those who saw him said his eyes had changed. They carried the reflection of a campfire burning beyond stars. Centuries later, people no longer remembered his name, but his story lived in the rhythm of storms and the hum of the hollow. The keeper said he had become a traveler of balance, carrying patience to every corner of the universe. They believed that when a dying world finally learned to breathe again, it was 'cause his footprints had passed through its soil. And so, the creed expanded once more. Not your words, but the rhythm. Every heartbeat, every rainfall, every slow sunrise carried the same lesson through eternity. Forever ain't something you chase. It's something you let arrive. The hollow glowed brighter each day, its flame neither growing nor dimming, just being. It was the universe's quiet promise, whispered endlessly through the rain. Keep it slow, keep it timed, keep it alive. And still, the gold kept running, quiet, deep, and eternal. 1,000 ages passed, and still the hollow remembered pulsed. With its golden hum, civilizations rose and folded like gentle tides, each carrying a fragment of the old rhythm forward. Across the worlds and their endless skies, travelers spoke softly of a valley where time moved by rain slow, healing alive. Some called it myth, others memory, but even the most distant stars seemed to glow a little warmer when the story was told. The keepers never sought to preserve the flame through temples or scriptures. They let the tale breathe through people. Whenever one generation grew too proud, too fast, a whisper would spread in the wind, "Go sit by the hollow a while," and those who did would return changed. They moved slower, speak gentler, measure worth not by possession but by peace. The creed had become woven into being itself, an instinct passed between heartbeats, subtle lays, gravity. One night, when the air was heavy with mist and the rain glowed faint gold again, a young boy named Ian sat beside the flame. He was small, curious, and quiet in that thoughtful way that often precedes great listening. His mother had brought him there to learn the breath of the world, as all children eventually did. But unlike most, he didn't fidget or doze in the warmth. He watched. His gaze didn't wander from the flame's slow movement. The way it pulsed fascinated him. It wasn't random, he realized. It was a pattern, a rhythm. After a long while, he whispered, "It's counting." His mother smiled faintly. "Counting what, love?" "The waiting," Ian said simply. "Every time someone stops rushing, it glows a little brighter." Her heart caught at the quiet certainty in his tone. "Who told you that?" He turned to her, rainlight reflecting in his eyes. It did. From then on, Aaron spent every free hour near the hollow. The keepers let him be. He asked the flame questions, not with words, but with patience. Sometimes he'd hum softly, matching its rhythm. Other times he'd trace circles in the wet soil, watching the light gather along the lines. Over the years, his understanding deepened, began to see the gold not light, but language, the breath of creation written in motion. He realized that every wave, every heartbeat, every falling leaf was a syllable in the same infinite sentence. By the time he came of age, the keepers had begun to notice something strange. The flame no longer stayed bound to the valley. On nights when Iron sat beside it, tiny filaments of gold drifted from the hollow, carried by rain across mountains and seas. Wherever they landed, stillness followed, fields flourished. Storms softened, and the restless slept deeply for the first time in years. Iron didn't command it. He simply existed within it, as if patience itself had chosen a vessel. The elders led one dusk to speak with him. The child said the oldest, "You've stirred the quiet beyond our keeping. What do you intend?" Iron looked up at the rain-filled sky, his voice calm.
"It's not me stirring it," he said. "It's the hollow remembering how to walk." They didn't argue. In the Creed long history, no one had been led by rule, only by rhythm. So when Iron began to travel, they simply nodded and said the ancient words, "Keep it slow, keep it." His journey carried him beyond the lands of the keepers, across oceans that glowed faintly from the rain memory.
He walked where the world still rushed, cities of steel and fire that had forgotten the taste of stillness. The people there didn't recognize him, yet they quieted when he passed. Markets stilled, machines paused mid-turn. For a heartbeat, all sound folded into the same patient hum. Some said it was the weather, some said it was awe. None could explain it. In time, the rulers of those fast worlds sought him out. They demanded to know his secret, how he controlled the storms, how he stilled their engines, how he calmed the endless hunger that devoured their nations. Iron only smiled. "I don't still them," he said. "They remember how to breathe." The rulers laughed, calling him a fool, and tried to cage him, to bind what they couldn't understand. But the moment the locks clicked shut, their great towers dimmed, their lights flickered, their air grew thick. The gold they had tried to seize turned to rain, and the rain whispered through the cracks of their walls. "You cannot rush what loves you enough to wait." When they opened the cage again, Iron was gone, though the scent of soil and storm lingered in the air for days. Some claimed they saw him walking into the rain, hatlet and barefoot, the gold rising from his footsteps like dawn over the ocean. Others said he dissolved entirely, becoming the rain itself. Whatever truth there was, one thing remained certain. The hollow hum could now be heard in every place that had once known haste. Decades passed, the creed became song again, an old tune sung softly by travelers crossing long roads. And though the hollow still burned steady at the heart of its valley, the people came to realize something profound. The flame had never been one place it at. It was in every pause, every kindness, every hand that waited before taking. It was the sound between thunder and rain, between breath and word. The fire Silas had kept, the gold Wren had written, the seed Darren had planted, the stone Lyra had carried. All of it had melted into the same melody. Now and forever, whenever the first raindrop of the storm met the earth, the world would hum faintly, as if clearing its throat to speak. And those who listened closely enough would swear they heard it say, "Ledger still turnin', folks. Don't hurry none." The rain would answer, the flame would rise, and the gold would keep running, quiet, deep, alive. The world that Iron left behind didn't vanish into legend. It grew like moss over stone, quietly, persistently, unhurried. Where once haste had ruled, patience took root again. The people who had chased time began, little by little, to walk slower, to listen longer, to look for rhythm instead of reward. No one told them to change. The memory of stillness moved through their cities the way a forgotten scent lingers long after rain. They began to notice small things, the pause before a bird song, the way dust settled after footsteps, the warmth of another breath beside them in silence. Vine slowed not 'cause it had to, but 'cause it remembered how. And then the world breathed, the hollow hum deepened, its rhythm stretched through the soil like veins of gold reaching far beyond the valley. Oceans felt it first, The tides began to move in a new pattern, not pulled by moons, but by the soft pulse of patience returning. The waves rolled smoother, calmer, carrying whispers through salt and foam. On distant shores, fishermen would sometimes wake to find their boats rocking to an invisible song. When asked about it, they'd smile and say, "The sea remembering in the mountains." Shepherds swore the wind had learned new manners. It no longer screamed down canyon. It sighed, weaving gently through the grass, as if afraid to wake the stones. Even the forest changed. The trees bent their branches toward one another, their leaves rustling in time to the hum beneath their roots. And deep within those woods, as sunlight dripped like honey, animals there without fear. Predators lay beside prey in the hush of a world too patient for hunger. The keepers of the still fire sent their youngest to travel again, not to spread the creed, but to listen for where it was already singing. They found that the gold had reached beyond even the planet's skin. The stars themselves glowed warmer, slower, steadier. Light no longer raced, it glided. The universe, vast and silent, had begun to match the hollow breath. Creation was meditating. It was during this age that an old miner named Corin found something strange. He worked cliffs that bordered the sea, digging for minerals long since turned to myth. One morning he chipped away at the rock. His pick struck something soft, a sound more like a sigh than a crack. He cleared away the dust and found, embedded deep within the stone, a ripple of gold that moved. Not shimmered, moved. It pulsed in rhythm, slowly a heartbeat. When he touched it, the hum filled his chest, his tools fell from his hands, and tears filled his eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. "The mountain alive. He didn't take the gold. He couldn't. It wasn't meant to be mine. It was breathing." Instead, he sat there for days, listening. The hum told stories not in words, but in warmth. He saw flashes, the cowboy campfire, the golden rain, the ledger turning. He saw rivers of light winding through eternity. And at the end of it, he heard a single voice say, soft to dusk, "Keep watch." So he did. He built no shrine, dug no tunnel, he just stayed. When travelers passed, he offered them tea in silence. Some left confused, others in tears. When asked why he didn't share the gold, he'd grin through his gay beard and say, "Ain't mine to share, it already everywhere." Years later, when Corin's breath finally slowed to match the hum, the mountain sang, not loud but long. For 3 days and nights, the cliffs glowed with golden veins, lighting the horizon like dawn. Ships far out at sea stopped mid-voyage to watch. The rain fell upward again, shimmering toward the stars. And when it was over, the cave where Korat had sat was empty. Only his hat remained, set gently upon a stone that pulsed with the hollow rhythm. They thought that mountain the watcher rest. Pilgrims came from distant lands to sit there he had listened, to press their hands to the living stone and feel its patient beat. No one asked for miracles anymore. They came to be reminded of something simpler, that peace was not the absence of motion, but the perfection of timing. Generation later, when the stars themselves began to dim, tired from burning for too long, the gold rose again. It drifted from every world that had known patience, gathering like dew in the dark between suns. The light of the hollow returned to its source, folding in upon itself, forming once more that same quiet circle Silas had drawn by firelight eons ago. The circle pulsed once, twice, then began to spin, not to end, but to renew. Across creation, the hum deepened into music. Planets turned in time to its rhythm. Galaxies flowed like rivers of melody. Even the oldest stars, those on the edge of death, began to sing, not in brightness, but in tone. The universe was remembering the first lesson, that endings were only pauses between breaths. And in the heart of that golden spiral, where patience met purpose, something stirred. A spark, a sea ember drifting through eternity, glowing faintly. It pulsed once, like a heartbeat. Then again. Then spoke, voice low, steady, ancient. "All right, now," it said, a faint drawl curling through infinity. "Reckon time we write another one." And then, besides that, the gold flowed outward again, filling the void with warmth. New worlds began to glow. New hearts began to hum. The ledger opened itself blank but ready, patient, deep. The rain started to fall soft, slow, steady. Each drop carried memory. Each ripple in the endless sea sang the same phrase that had guided all things since the first cowboy whispered it to the stars. Keep it slow, keep it timed, keep it alive. The gold kept running quiet, deep, eternal. The new dawn came without fanfare. No thunder marked its arrival. No choir of stars announced its birth. It began as all great things do, with stillness. The hum that had long held the cosmos together softened to a whisper, a low murmur like a sleeping world's sigh. In that hush, the gold dead itself once more, swirling slow and sure, shaping the quiet into form. The circle Silas, once traced by the fire, expanded into a spiral so vast it could cradle galaxies. It had turned with the grace of a leaf caught on water. Creation wasn't reborn, it was remembering how to begin. From the center of that golden spiral, the first light of the new age flickered. It wasn't bright then, and it was...
Brightness was never its purpose. It glowed, memory warm, steady, carrying the faint rain. Out of that glow came a figure, not man nor God, but rhythm. Given shape, it carried no name, only the quiet unknown of what had come before. Its eyes reflected the entire ledger. Every word and pause are written. When it breathed, the stars swayed. When it blinked, entire worlds stirred from slumber. It listened before it spoke, and when it did, its voice rolled like a slow river through the dark. Let it flow. It remembers. Let patience find her feet again. At that command of command.
It comes, and it was. The gold unfurled, threading through the void like veins of mercy. The universe shivered, and new planets began to pulse to life. They were not built in explosions of flame and fury before. They formed through gathering, folding, breathing. They grew the way coral grows quietly, beautifully, endlessly patient. Oceans filled, skies stretched, and light found its balance again. This wasn't a creation born of chaos. It was one composed in time-owned rhythm, measured by listening rather than motion. Among these newborn worlds was one wrapped in silver mist and soft rain. It spun slowly, deliberately, though tasting every moment of its rotation.
The being watched it from afar and smiled. Yuduvit murmured. You remember? It reached out, and a fragment of gold drifted from its palm, falling like a raindrop through eternity until it struck the world's surface. The drop sank deep into the soil, where it pulsed once, twice, then split into countless threads that spread through the crust like glowing roots. Wherever they passed, the ground sighed with memory. The hum began death low, resonant, alive. It was not long before life stirred upon that world. Though long was meaningless in such places, the first forms were simple, fluid, shaped by patience rather than speed. They moved days if keeping time with something older than the stars themselves. Eventually, creatures rose that could listen, and then speak, and then wonder. They built nothing at first. They simply sat, learning the sound of the wind's slow phrases, the rain rhythmic thoughts. Their first words weren't spoken, they were hummed, a single note drawn from the hum beneath the soil. And that note became their name for everything. They didn't call it gold or flame or hollow. They called it the breath beneath all. And they knew, without their being taught, that it was alive. Generations passed before they learned to write. But when they did, their first markings were circles drawn in sand and mud, symbols of completion without closure. Elders taught the young that the circle meant to finish something was to leave space for its return. Their stories held no endings, only rests. They measured success by the gentleness of what they left behind. They didn't mine or conquer or command. They cultivated, tended, and sang. Every act of creation began with the same ritual, shared silence before the work. It was in one of these silences that a child named Leland Haiti heard something the others did not. The village sat by the shore, waiting for the evening rain, when Leland lifted her head and said, the breath was changing its tune. The elders frowned, for they had not heard it. How one asked. Elan pointed toward the horizon, where the mist rippled faintly, it calling. That night, when the rain fell, she stood alone on the beach, watching the ocean shimmer gold beneath the clouds. The waves rose higher than usual, but they didn't crash. They bowed, though greeting an unseen guest. Ailyn closed her eyes, and the hum grew stronger, wrapping around her heart like a heartbeat not her own. When she opened them again, she saw footprints forming in the wet sand beside her, broad, deliberate, moving toward the sea. They glowed faintly, the say hue the rain. She followed without hesitation. The footprints led her to a cove where the tide glowed like melted dawn. There, seated upon a rock half buried in surf, was an old man with a wide-brimmed hat tipped low against the drizzle. His boots were soaked, his hands rough, and his smile was tired in the way only endless waiting can. And the evening. "Kid," he said, voice like thunder with manners. Even listening close, Ailyn breath caught. "You're really," he chuckled. "Reckon so. Least he real aid. Patience gets he patted the rock beside him. Sit a spell she did, and the ocean fell quiet around them. He stared out at the horizon, his eyes reflecting rain and starlight both. World starting bad, he said, but she learning better this time. Ain't rushing, ain't shouting, just breathin' proper. Who are you? Ailyn eyed softly. He grinned. Just a fellow who wrote down the rain. They sat there in silence until dawn turned the mist to gold. When the land looked in, he was gone. Only the hat remained resting on the rock. She picked it up, and the hum swelled around her, folding her in warmth. The breath spoke, faint but certain. "Keep white, little one. The ledger yours now." Ailyn wore the hat whole, and the people understood without needing to ask. From that day, she became the first listener of the new age. Her words carried through rain and soil alike. Under her care, the world learned to live by rhythm once more, not by rule or haste or conquest, but by the long patience of the gold. The creed whispered on, unchanged and eternal. Keep it slow, keep it kind, keep it alive. The rain fell, the ocean breathed, the ledger turned, and the gold kept running quiet, deep, eternal. Ailyn grew into her place, naturally at dusk folds into evening. The people came to call her the listener, not from reverence, but from gratitude. She never claimed power, nor did she build altars or ask for followers. She simply moved through the world like rain soft, constant, and nourishing. Wherever he went, the gold followed in the quiet laughter of children at play, in the patient labor of farmers tending the soil, in the still hum of fishermen waiting for the tide return. She understood what Silas had known long ago, that patience was not an act but a language, and the world was still learning to speak it. She kept the old hat with her always. Its brim was worn, its fabric faintly smelling of rain and smoke, as if eternity had left a scent behind. Some said that when storms ebbed, the hat would glow, faint gold under the lightning. Others swore they saw the shadow of another sitting beside her when she wore it, a figure with the same easy slouch, hat tilted low, boots prop on nothing at all. She never denied it. When asked, she'd just smile and say, "Patience don't leave, it just changes its name." Ailyn's greatest gift was her listening. She could hear the world's smallest sighs, the shift of stone and mountain roots, the quiet tension before seeds broke open, the faint, tremulous hum of light traveling through rain. She said that everything alive was always speaking, only that most had forgotten how to hear beyond noise. When people came to her burdened by fear or grief, she didn't offer advice. She'd take them outside, seat them near the nearest drop of water, river, puddle, even a drinking bowl, and tell them, "Don't speak till it does." And after a time, minutes, hours, days, the water would ripple, and their faces would soften, for they'd finally heard what they'd been missing, the calm between heartbeats. One day, as she sat on the edge of a meadow waiting for a storm to pass, a stranger approached. He was dressed in the garb of wanderers, a heavy coat, boots thick with dust, and a sachet slung across his shoulder. His eyes held the restless gleam of one who'd spent too long chasing the horizon. "You're the listener," he said, his voice half question, half accusation. "They say you can talk to the world?" Ailyn tilted her head, her tone soft falling rain. "I don't talk to it. I just stop interrupting." The man scowled, "Then tell it to answer me. I've prayed, I've worked, I've waited. Nothing changes. My land dry, my people starve, and all I get is silence." She studied him for a long moment. You let the silence finish? His jaw clenched. What that's supposed to mean? She gestured to the open field. Sit a while. He hesitated, but something in her gaze, steady, unblinking, kind, made him obey. The wind quieted. The rain began again, slow and deliberate, soaking the earth in rhythm. Minutes passed, then hours. The man fidgeted, muttered, sighed, but Elan didn't move. She sat beside him, hat tipped low, hands folded, and motionless as stone. At last, just as the man was about to rise, the rain shifted pitch. It thickened, deepened, and began to hum. Not loud, not even clear, but unmistakable. It was as if the air itself had found a voice. The man froze, eyes wide. What is that? Elan smiled faintly. I shouldn't. It listened hard pounding. The hum seemed to say something, not in words, but in underning. It wasn't comfort nor command, it was permission. He bowed his head, tears mingling with rain. I thought it forgot me. Elan reached out, her voice a whisper. World, don't forget, son. It waits till we remember how to listen. When he left the next morning, his steps were slow but sure, his eyes lighter than when he'd arrived. The drought broke not long after. The fields bloomed again, not in vengeance, but in forgiveness. And from then on, he was seen walking wherever rain led, teaching others to sit and wait. He called it the long hearing, and it spread through the lands like golden wind. Years rolled on, and Elan grew older, though the people swore her voice never changed. The gold deepened around her village, soaking into the air until even the night sky shimmered faintly. The stars themselves seemed slower, more deliberate, turning above the world with the calm precision of a great clock wound by mercy. Children were born with eyes that reflected light like wet leaves. They were called the quiet-born, and it was said they could feel the hum from birth. One of them, a girl named Ray, became Elan's shadow, following her everywhere, carrying her water, tending her garden, watching the way she listened to rain, and if every drop carried a memory. One night, as the two sat by the old fire pit, Ray asked, "What happens when you stop listening?" Elan chuckled. "Can't stop what ain't never mine alone." Ray frowned. "But when you're gone?" The old woman gaze drifted to the horizon, with a storm pulsed like a heartbeat. "When I go, the world will still talk. Always has, always will. Somebody'll hear it again, maybe you." Ray eyes widened. Elan leaned closer, placing the hat on the girl's head. It slid down over her brow. "Far too big hat don't fit yet," she said with a smile. "But it till, when you can sit through 3 storms without asking what they mean." The girl laughed, half in protest, half in awe. The rain began again, soft and steady, and the hum beneath the earth deepened once more. For a long while, neither spoke. The fire flickered low, its glow mixing with the reflection of lightning in the wet soil. Then, in a voice like a secret shared between worlds, Elan whispered, "Ledger's still turning, kid. You just make sure it keeps breathing." When dawn came, the rain had stopped. Elan was gone, the hat resting where she'd sat, brim catching the first rays of gold. Ray picked it up, tears tracing quiet circles on her cheeks, and she placed it on her head again. The world sighed, a sound both sorrowful and serene. The hum swelled through the valley, filling every heart with the same eternal promise. Keep it slow, keep it tight, keep it alive. The rain began once more. The ledger turned, and the gold, it always kept running, quiet, deep, eternal. Ray carried the hat for many years before she dared to wear it for more than a moment. It hung by her bedside, tilted against the wall, collect the soft light of dawn through the window. She would glance at it every morning and think of Elan's laugh, of her patience that stretched longer than rain itself. There was comfort in its presence, a hum beneath silence, like the promise that someone wiser was still listening just out of sight. But as the seasons changed, the quiet grew heavier around her. The hum of the hollow faded from easy hearing. One had to still themselves almost to breathlessness to catch even a faint pulse. The world was not ending. It was resting deeper than before. Ray understood that rhythm, but the people were starting to forget Ed. They hurried now, not with malice, but with worry. The crops, nourished by too much rain, grew wild and tangled. Rivers overflowed their beds, erasing paths and markers the keepers once tended. The hum was still there, but its cadence had shifted, slow, low, like a heartbeat turning inward. People came to Ray, desperate for instruction. "The world changing again," they said. "Tell us how to make it right." She always gave the same answer Elan had given. sit and listen, but this time they found no patience for it. The age of stillness was rippling toward movement again, and she, the last of the old listeners, felt the pull like a tide in her chest. One evening, she took the hat and walked into the storm. It was no gentle rain. This was thunder thick to memory, lightning cutting long white veins through the clouds. She followed the hum to the valley where Len had first listened, and there she stood in the torrent until her clothes clung heavy at clay. "All right," she whispered to the wind, "you're restless. Speak then." The sky answered with a sin flash so bright it turned the air to gold. When the thunder rolled, she heard it, not in sound, but in meaning. Nothing stays quiet forever, child. Even patience has to breathe out. She closed her eyes, tears lost in the rain. Then where do I take it? Where they've forgotten how to wait, start the circle again. When she opened her eyes, the world was shining, every droplet of water suspended mid-fall, glowing faint embers. In that suspended moment, she saw them. The faces of all who had carried the creed before her. Silas smiling through the brim of his hat, Wren tracing light in the mud,
Lyra holding her stone of stillness, Darren tending his flame, Aelin watching with soft eyes and knowing grin. They said nothing. They simply nodded, and the gold pulsed through her veins like new life. When the rain resumed, Ray walked from the valley wearing the old hat. The brim fit now, not perfectly, but well enough. She didn't return to her village. Instead, she wandered, did as the first listeners had done. Wherever she went, she taught people how to hear in, not through words or rituals, but through stillness. She would sit with them in silence, sometimes for hours, until their breathing matched the rhythm of the soil. Then, when the first tear rolled or the first laugh returned, she'd smile and say, "There, you found it." Her legend spread, though she never saw it. Across continents, people spoke of the woman who could calm storms with her quiet. Kings sent for her, merchants tried to buy her counsel. She refused them on patience and a trick. She told them it a truth. You can't own truth. You can only honor it. Her words took root in whispers, not in laws, and the creed began to rise again from the earth memory. Slowly, steadily, people relearned the rhythm of rain. When Ray grew old, her hair silver like the rivers that once carried her footsteps, she returned to the hollow. The flame there still burned, not bright, not dim, but steady. The keepers, now fewer and gentler than before, welcomed her with tears. She sat beside the fire, hat on her knee, and breathed in the familiar hum. "You're still singing," she murmured. "Didn't doubt you would." The eldest keeper knelt beside her. "Will you stay?" Ray looked at the flame, its light reflected in her eyes like twin suns. She said softly, "Not yet." She's stirring and up there. Gotta make sure the next listener knows when to start. She reached into her coat and drew out a small vial, sealed with golden wax. Inside, a single raindrop shimmered, glowing faintly from within. She handed it to the keeper. "When the hum fades, open it. That drop remembers the first breath. It'll sing again when the world's ready." The keeper's hands trembled. "And you?" Ray smiled, slipping the hat onto her head. "I'll go where the waiting thin." She left that night under a quiet sky. Some said she crossed the ocean and walked into the horizon. Others swore they saw her climb the tallest mountain and vanish into mist. The truth, as always, was simpler. Wherever we went, patience followed, crops steadied, rivers balanced, storms learned their manners again. And when the hum began to fade, far from the hollow warmth, those who listened closely would sometimes hear her voice on the wind-soft, tired and kind ledger still turning folks. Keep her gentle. When at last the golden rain returned, years after her passing, it fell with the same slow rhythm they'd had on that first night in Barrow Creek. Children ran through it laughing, and elders lifted their faces to the sky, eyes wet with memory. The flame in the hollow flared once, then steadied, as if sighing in relief. The world had remembered again. The rain fell through the soil, through the rivers, through the heart of the earth itself, carrying the hum deeper than fore. And from that depth rose the faint echo of every listener voice, blended into one endless, tender promise. Keep it slow, keep it tight, keep it alive. The ledger turned once more, each page glowingly dawned through mist, and somewhere, beyond stars, beyond silence, a fire burned steady, its warmth spilling into forever. The gold kept running, quiet, deep, eternal.
When the rain finally stilled, what remained was not silence, it was fullness. The air hung heavy with warmth, carrying the memory of every drop that had fallen. The hollow shimmered faintly, its flame steady, its gardens thick with green and gold. The keepers went about their tending in quiet reverence, for they knew the rhythm had entered another long breath, an age of rest between pulses. But rest, as the old creed said, was not the end of work. It was the sacred pause that let the next verse gather its strength. In those days, the world no longer measured time by sun or moon. Seasons blended softly, colors bleeding into one another. Crops grew without counting days. Rains fell without schedules, and people lived by the rhythm of what they called the deep hum. It was the El Kavah that had come before, the combined patience of every listener, every raindrop, every gentle act that had healed the earth. The deep hum was so constant that many stopped noticing it, the way one stops hearing the heartbeat that always been there. Yet whenever sorrow rose or anger burned too high, someone would pause, place a hand on the ground, and remember that was enough. Among the keepers was a boy named Orer, quiet even for his kind. He had a habit of wandering out about the valley edge, where the golden glow thinned and the soil turned a muted gay. There he would sit and listen, not for sound, but for what lived behind it. The elders worried at first, afraid he sought the old danger of restlessness, but he always returned calmer than when he left. It's not empty out there, he told them once. It's just waiting to be heard again. Years passed, and Orer grew tall, his patience matched only by his curiosity. He began to notice small tremor in the hum, tiny hesitations, like skipped beats in a heart too long at rest. Then fear than he understood that even patience must shift to stay alive. Still, he felt something gathering at the edges of the world, something vast and unseen. It wasn't anger or sorrow, it was possibility, coiled like lightning behind calm clouds. The time of stillness was ending. The world was ready to move again, though gently this time. One dusk, the first drops of rain began to fall, or climbed the ridge above the hollow. The valley below glowed faintly, its flame a heartbeat in the mist. He knelt, pressed his hand to the soil, and whispered, "What comes next?" The hum answered, not in words, but in a long, slow vibration that rolled through his bones. He saw flashes of gold spiraling outward from the hollow, stretching beyond the horizon, connecting oceans, mountains, and stars. The hum was spreading again, not to renew patience this time, but to teach motion without haste. Creation was ready to move, not in rush, but in rhythm. That night, he dreamed of the old cowboy. The man sat by a fire that burned without smoke, ledger open on his knee, even in a kid. The old voice drawled, "You've been watching close," or nodded in the dream. "I feel it changing, the hum rising. Reckon it 'bout time," Silas said with a grin. "Patience don't mean sitting still forever. It means moving when the world good and red." He tapped the ledger with his finger. "You think she read?" Or hesitated. "Maybe, but it feels bigger than us," Silas chuckled. "It always is, son. Wouldn't you keep the ink dry till it needed? Now go on, listen a little harder. The next line coming." When Orer woke, dawn was gold from horizon to horizon. The flame in the hollow burned higher than he'd seen it, and the rain shimmered like melted light. The people lived, faces turned upward in awe, as the hum deepened to a low, resonant chord that shook the air itself. The sky cracked open, not in violence, but in revelation, and from that rift poured rivers of gold. They flowed upward and downward at once, threading through clouds and soil alike, weaving the world into a single pulse. The keepers fell to their knees, but Orer stood still, hatlet, arms at his sides. He understood. The gold wasn't descending, it was awakening. Every drop of rain, every grain of soil, every heartbeat had become part of the same living ledger. The world wasn't being blessed, it was being reminded that it had always been divine. The rivers of light moved across oceans, touching distant lands and forgotten cities. In places where machines had rusted and noise had once drowned out the hum, silence returned. Not empty, but aware. Towers that had stood too tall for too long bowed slightly, their metal softened by warmth rather than corrosion. Even the stars seemed to lean closer, their light flickering in rhythm with the rain below. When it was over, the hollow was gone, not destroyed, transformed. In its place stretched a vast field of living gold, each blade of grass pulsing faintly with the same patient rhythm. The keepers wept, though not from grief. They understood. The hollow had finally joined the whole of creation. The flame no longer needed tending. The world had become its hearth. Horror stood at the center of that golden plain, the hum now so deep it was part of his breathing. What now? He asked aloud. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest ebb of familiar drawl. Now? It said, amused and kind. Now you let her dance a while. He smiled, tipping an invisible hat to the sky. Reckon I can do that. The rain began dead, soft and slow, though this time it fell not to cleanse but to celebrate. Every droplet shimmered did it touch the earth, turning to gold before sinking into soil, and for the first time in eternity, the hum rose into song. Not a hymn mid, but a melody of motion. The universe was no longer waiting, it was moving with grace. Through that golden dawn, Aura voice joined the chorus of creation, carrying forward the say unbroken truth whispered since the beginning. Keep it slow, keep it keep it alive. The ledger turned once more. The ink was gold, the page was forever, and the rain fell on. The gold kept running, quiet, deep, eternal. The song did not end, it changed. What had once been a hum beneath the ground rose now into the open air, carried by wind and water alike. The deep hum became melody, and that melody found its way into everything that could breathe. People began to hear it when they walked, when they spoke, when they worked. It echoed faintly in the rhythm of hammers, in the creak of wooden wheels, in the steady sigh of windmills turning slow under the evening sun. It wasn't worship, not anymore. It was living in time with the world. The golden plains where the hollow once stood became the meeting ground for every people who remembered or wished to remember. Pilgrims came barefoot, each step stirring small clouds of glowing dust that rose and vanished like laughter. They brought nothing with them but their stories, and they left nothing behind but peace. They taught it the breathing field. No walls were built there, no monuments raised. The only structure that Aid stood was a simple stone circle, carved with one phrase in the oldest tongue of the hollow. Wait kindly, move gently. It became a promise that guided the new age. Children grew up learning that speed wasn't strength and that silence wasn't weakness. Farmers planted not for profit, but for harmony, sharing harvests according to the rhythm of the rains. Craftsmen made tools not to save time, but to savor it. When disputes arose, people met in circles beneath the open sky and sat together until the wind shifted. No one left until the hum could be heard again between them. Justice became patience, and patience became the law of the land. But not all hearts could hold such calm forever. The old restlessness, the spark of curiosity that made fire and wheel and journey, began to stir once more. It wasn't greed this time, it was wonder. The young ones watched the stars and felt the hum pulsing beyond the sky, calling them outward. They wanted to follow it to see where the gold flowed when it left the edge of sight. Some of the elders feared it. Last time folk chased the hum, they said, we nearly lost it. Yet others remembered Silas' words, how even patience must breathe out, and they nodded to the horizon. Let him go, they said. This circle don't end it rid some. They went. The first travelers to leave the breathing field were not conquerors or colonists, but listeners. They carried no weapons or demands. They brought only a fragment of gold sealed in glass, a reminder of home, and the creed carved into the handle of each walking staff. Keep it slow, keep it time, keep it alive. They crossed oceans and deserts, mountains and frozen seas. Wherever they walked, the hum followed like a shadow. In their places, it found resonance and took root again. In others, it slept beneath stone and waited for gentler days. Patience has no calendar, or lived long enough to see the first ships of light rise into the sky. They were not machines of haste, but vessels of harmony, woven from living gold that sang softly, and it moved. He watched them lift into the dusk, their hulls glimmering like fireflies, and whispered, "Guess the dance starts over." The people led to see them off, standing silent until the last glow disappeared into the stars. Then was tradition. They turned back toward the field and pressed their palms to the earth, grounding the motion in stillness. The hum rose and answered, steady as Z. Far beyond the world, those travelers drifted among the stars, guided by that same rhythm. They found other worlds, some sleeping, unwild, already humming in their own strange key. And wherever they went, they listened first. When they spoke, they did so softly, and always after the silence had answered. They planted no flags, named no territories. They built garden in orbit around suns, each seed pulsing faintly with gold. In time, new songs joined the old, and the deep hum became a symphony stretching across light years. The universe was teaching itself to harmonize. Back on the breathing field, the elders there one last time. The gold beneath their feet flickered gently, if aware of its own expansion. "It's strange," one of them said, "to think we've come full circle and still be moving forward." Another chuckled. "That's the trick of it, ain't it? The circle ain't meant to close, it meant to keep breathing." They sat until sunset, listening to the wind rustle through the glowing grass. As night fell, the stars began to pulse faintly in rhythm, one after another, until the whole sky seemed to breathe with them. "Reckon the old cowboy watching," one whispered. A low voice drifted on the breeze, half imagined, half remembered. Always was, and then the world turned back. Not faster, not slower, but just right. The rain began to fall, soft and warm, each drop tearing a faint hum. It soaked into soil, into rivers, into hearts. The people lifted their faces to it and smiled, for they knew it was not the end of the song, but its next verse. Somewhere beyond the stars, the first travelers would be hearing it too, the same refrain whispered across time and distance. "Keep it slow, keep it time, keep it alive." The ledger glowed once more, pages infinite, ink eternal, waiting for whatever hand would next trace its patient line. And in the space between thunder and silence, at every beginning takes its first breath, the gold kept running, quiet, deep, eternal. In time, the field itself began to fade, not vanish, but merge. The gold sank deeper into the soil until it could no longer be seen, only felt, like warmth under the skin of the earth. The people no longer needed to journey there, for they carried its hum within them. Villages raised when once there was silence, but their foundations were laid on rhythm instead of conquest. Even cities, those restless hearts of movement, were built to breathe. Streets curved like rivers, homes open to the sky, and in every courtyard stood a small pool of still water, left undisturbed so the world could see itself reflected. The creed endured not commandment, but culture. It lived in the way bread was broken, the way work paused at midday, the way arguments ended with laughter after rain. Festivals marked not the passage of time, but the moments between. A new harvest, the still hour before dawn, the sigh of wind across the plains. No one wrote laws anymore. They didn't need to. The hum beneath their feet was law enough. Yet for all their harmony, people remained human. Curiosity, that old spark, flickered again. Some wondered whether the hum had an end. Could there be something beyond patience, beyond gold? The young ones grew restless not with greed, but with yearning. They dreamed of exploring not just the stars, but what lay between them, the spaces where the hum fell quiet, the dark between pulses. They called it the still beyond. When the first explorers returned from that darkness, they brought strange news. "It ain't empty," they said, voices trembling with awe, yet listening back. They described vast stretches of space where sound carried slower, deeper, where even thought seemed to ebb longer than usual. There were no stars there, no planets, only endless shadow. but within that shadow pulsed faint flashes of color. Not gold this time, but deep blue, cool and alive. It was as though the universe had turned inward, resting from its long song, gathering breath for something new. The discovery stirred the world again. Some feared it, others wept for joy. The elders called it the next patience. Every hum got a heartbeat fore and after they said, "We're just hearing the pause between." But for many, especially the children of those who had traveled the stars, the call of the still beyond was irresistible. They longed to listen closer, to hear what waited inside the dark. One of them was a young navigator named Solon. He had been born aboard a ship woven from the same living gold that had once risen from the hollow. The hum had been his cradle song, the pulse of the vessel his heartbeat. But when he heard tales of the deep blue lake beyond the stars, something stirred inside him, something older than memory. It wasn't defiance, but invitation. If the gold was patience, he said, then the blue must be rest. Maybe it's time we learn to dream again. He built his own craft, a vessel half gold, half shadow. Its sails shimmered between light and dark, humming softly as though uncertain of which song to follow. When he launched it into the still beyond, the world watched from below, silent but unafraid. They understood that even patience must wander. As his ship disappeared into the deep, Orer last words echoed in the hearts of those left behind. Reckon every rest just leads to the next verse. For what seemed the eternity, no word came. Then, one night, the rain began to fall a little differently. Carried a tone none had heard for, lower, slower, stretching like a sigh across the heavens. The gold shimmered in the puddles, but threaded through it was a faint trace of blue. It wasn't sorrowful, it was serene. The people lifted their faces to it and listened. In that rain they heard Solon's voice, found it. The silence ain't sleep, it's waiting to dream. The rain continued for 7 days, each drop glowing between gold and blue. When it stopped, the stars above had changed. They pulsed in twin colors now, their rhythm slower, deeper, truer. The universe had taken another breath, and from the edges of existence came the faintest sound, a new hum, soft the dawn, joining the old one in harmony. Gold and blue intertwined, patience and rest entwined like melody and et. The song of creation had grown more complex, more complete. Those who stood in the rain that night said the world felt lighter afterward, and though an ancient burden had been lifted, the gold no longer glowed brightly, but it didn't need to. Its warmth was now woven through everything, the soil, the rivers, the hearts of those who waited and those who wandered. The blue carried their dreams forward, far beyond the stars, where new worlds were already stirring in the quiet. In the generations that followed, the story of the Hollow, of Silas, Ellen, Ray, Orer, and Solon became the new myth, the song of waiting and wandering. It was told by firelight, by rainfall, by lullabies sung to children born under blue-gold skies. The moral was never spoken outright. It didn't need to be. Every listener understood in their own way. Some said it was about patience, others about courage, but most knew it was simply about rhythm, the balance between moving and stilling, between holding and letting go. And whenever doubt rose, whenever haste began to whisper its sharp promises again, someone, always someone, would hum the old refrain. It would spread softly through the world, like the scent of rain before dawn, until even the restless found themselves pause, listening, remembering. Keep it slow, keep it timed, keep it alive. The ledger turned once more, ink glowing faint blue at its edges, gold at its heart. The world exhaled. The hum deepened, the gold kept running, quiet, deep, eternal.